For years, the neighbors only knew Max as a terrifying guard dog. His growls enough to send children running and keep strangers far away. But one night, a simple knock at the gate shattered everything they thought they knew. When a stranger whispered a name from the past, Max's rage turned to joy, and Frank, the hardened veteran who trusted no one, was left stunned as his fiercest protector revealed a hidden bond. What secret could transform a feared beast into a bridge between father and son and change an entire neighborhood story forever? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The first sound anyone heard before they even saw him was a low, rumbling growl that seemed to rise out of the earth itself. It came from behind the rusted iron gates of the old house on Birchwood Lane, a warning carried on the still morning air. The sound belonged to Max, a thick-coated German shepherd whose reputation stretched farther than the street he guarded. To some, he was nothing but a beast, a shadow with teeth and eyes that glinted in the half-light. To others, he was the last offensive man who lived too long alone. But to anyone who dared step closer, the growl was enough to quicken their pace and remind them that the property behind the gates was not to be disturbed. Max had been a fixture of the neighborhood for years, yet no one ever felt comfortable in his presence. He patrolled the fence line like a soldier on endless duty, his paws pressing worn paths into the soil. Every morning, joggers steered clear of the east side of Birchwood, taking the longer route just to avoid the house. Mail carriers delivered envelopes with quick movements, sliding them through the narrow slot and pulling back their hands before Max could lunge. Children on bicycles would ride faster, tires rattling over the uneven pavement, casting nervous glances toward the gate in case the beast behind it decided today was the day he would break free. It wasn't only the noise that frightened them, it was the eyes. Deep, amber, and unblinking, Max watched every passerby with the focus of a sentinel who trusted no one. His growl wasn't the erratic bark of an undisciplined animal. It was deliberate, a steady reminder that this ground was his, and trespass would not be forgiven. People whispered stories about him. Some swore they saw him leap so high against a fence that his paws hooked over the top, teeth snapping inches from their faces. Others claimed he had once pinned down a trespasser until the owner pulled him off, leaving the man shaken and bleeding. Whether the stories were true or not, they fed the legend that surrounded him, and in time, no one questioned them. The house itself did little to soften the impression. Weathered paint peeled from the wooden siding, and ivy clung to the porch railings as though trying to pull the structure back into the earth. Broken shutters rattled when the wind blew, and the front yard was little more than patches of tall grass mixed with dirt. It was the kind of place children dared each other to touch, running up to the gate only to retreat as soon as the low growl started. Yet amid the decay, Max stood like a king, his thick fur brushing against the rusted bars, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of constant vigilance. On most days, the growl was his only language. He had no patience for strangers, no warmth for kind words offered through the fence. Neighbors tried, on occasion, to win him over with scraps of food or soft voices, but his suspicion was unshakable. He would sniff the air, rumble deep in his throat, and retreat only when the hand disappeared. To them, he was unchangeable, a creature locked in habits as old as the house itself. There was something in his bearing that mirrored the man he lived with. Frank, the elderly veteran who owned property, carried himself with the same guarded presence. Few saw him often, but when they did, it was usually in the evenings when he stood quietly on the porch, a cigarette glowing between his fingers while Max paced below. Frank never had to raise his voice. A small gesture, a quiet command, and the dog obeyed instantly, sitting back on his haunches but never breaking his stare at whoever dared come close. For the neighborhood, Max became a symbol of warning. He was the embodiment of the house's mystery, the reason no one lingered too long by the gate. His growl set the rhythm of life on Birchwood Lane. The paper boy knew the exact spot to throw the newspaper, so he wouldn't have to come within reach. Teenagers walking home from school lowered their voices when they passed. Even delivery drivers kept their engines running as they dropped packages, anxious to escape the presence of the dog, who seemed to judge their every movement. And yet, beneath the growl, there was something that most failed to notice. A flicker of recognition in the eyes when children laughed too close, a brief pause in his patrol, when the evening wind carried a scent he remembered. But those moments were brief. buried quickly beneath the duty that had been drilled into him. To everyone else, Max was only the growl in the morning, the bark in the night, and the reason the old house on the hill stood untouched. It was enough to make people believe he would never change, never soften, never wag his tail for anyone but the man who lived in the shadows of that house. At least, that was what they thought, until the day a figure appeared at the gate, and Max's growl faltered for the very first time. The house stood on the rise at the end of Birchwood Lane, its silhouette pressing against the sky like a memory no one could quite forget. Even from a distance, it carried the weight of years, a place that seemed less like a home and more like an echo of another time. The paint had long since surrendered to seasons, peeling away in strips that revealed gray wood beneath. Ivy crept up its sides in tangled fingers, pulling at the shutters and weaving itself into cracks along the foundation. When the wind moved, the house creaked inside as though it remembered every winter storm, every summer heat, every moment it had stood watching the world change around it. The fences that circled the property were no better. Once white and sharp, they were now weathered and splintering, their slats leaning like old men unable to stand straight. Rust coated the iron gate, flaking into the soil whenever the hinges moved. Grass grew tall in patches, left to bend in the wind, while weeds forced their way between stones that had once marked a neat path to the porch. The air around it carried the scent of earth and dampness, a smell that clung to old houses that no longer tried to resist time. Neighbors told stories about the house, letting their imaginations fill in the spaces that silence left open. Children whispered that it was haunted, pointing to the dark windows that seemed to stare back at them with hollow eyes. Teenagers dared each other to step onto the porch at night, to touch the door that everyone said had not been opened by anyone other than the owner in decades. Some swore they saw lights flicker in the attic window when no one should have been there. Others claimed they heard footsteps in the yard, heavy and measured, long before the guard dog appeared. Adults were no less prone to storytelling. They spoke in hushed voices of the man who lived there, Frank, who had come back from war with more ghosts than friends. They wondered what drove him to live alone on the hill, refusing offers of sell, ignoring the steady creep of decay. Some pitied him, some judged him, but all agreed that the dog at his side made him untouchable. Together, the man and his dog kept the house sealed from the rest of the world. On summer evenings, when the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the lane, the house looked almost like a ruin. The porch sagged under its own weight, boards soft with rot, railings broken in places where storms had torn them loose. Shutters dangled on rusted hinges, banging against the siding when the wind pushed them. The windows reflected little, their glass dull by years of dust, leaving anyone who tried to peer inside with only their own reflection staring back. Despite all this, the house carried a strange kind of dignity. Its Gothic roofline, though battered, still arched proudly against the sky. The chimneys, though blackened and chipped, stood tall, reminders of the warmth that had once filled the rooms below. The wraparound porch, even as it leaned, gave a hint of the grandeur it once offered, a place where families might have gathered, where laughter could have spilled out into the night. The bones of the house were strong, defying time even as the surface crumbled. People said the house changed after Frank brought Max home. Before that, it had been silent, an empty shell with only its creaks and sighs for company. But once the dog arrived, the property took on a new life. His growls carried through the night, breaking the stillness and reminding everyone that the house was not abandoned, not forgotten. The old wood might bend and the paint might peel, but Max's presence was like a boundary drawn in the earth. It said clearly that whatever stories people told, the house was still claimed, still watched, still alive in its own way. From the top of the hill, the view stretched far across the town. You could see the church steeple in the distance, the clustered rooftops of neighbors below, the winding road that led out to the main street. The house had once been a place of status, built to look over the town as if in quiet command. Now it looked down with something closer to suspicion, its shadow a reminder of years that refused to be erased. No one lingered at the base of the hill for long. The fence, the gate, the dog, and the silence beyond were enough to push people along. Yet, even as they walked away, they carried the image of the house with them. It stayed in their minds like an unanswered question, a secret held too tightly. And at the center of it all, pacing behind the gate, Max guarded not just a man and a property, but the weight of everything the house had come to represent. It was a place that had outlasted storms, gossip, and time itself. And though no one could agree on what exactly held within its walls, everyone agreed on one thing. Nothing about the old house on the hill was ordinary. Frank was the kind of man people noticed without really knowing. His figure was lean, his movements deliberate, and his silence heavier than most words. The neighbors saw him sometimes at the edge of the yard, standing still with his hands in his pockets, a cigarette burning slowly between his fingers as the smoke curled into the evening air. He didn't invite conversation, and no one lingered long enough to force it. They called him a veteran, though few could recall which war he had served in, and fewer still had the courage to ask. He had the posture of someone who had spent years standing at attention, the gaze of someone who had looked too long into things he would rather forget. He had lived in the old house for decades, moving in after his return from service, when the town was different, when the fences were still white and the porch still solid. Over time, as the wood weathered and the paint peeled, Frank himself seemed to settle into the same rhythm of slow decline. He worked odd jobs when he needed money, kept mostly to himself, and refused to sell even when the property value sank. To him, the house was more than timber and nails. It was a place where he could live out his years without answering to anyone. Max came into his life on a gray afternoon nearly 10 years earlier. The dog had been nothing more than a shivering pup when Frank found him, abandoned behind the hardware store. His fur was matted, his ribs visible, his eyes filled with the same kind of wariness Frank recognized in himself when he looked in the mirror. Something passed between them then, a recognition, a quiet understanding that neither would abandon the other. Frank carried him home in his coat, fed him scraps, and built a space by the hearth where the pup could sleep. From that day forward, the old house was no longer silent. Training began almost immediately. Frank was not a man who believed in half measures. Discipline was in his bones, and he gave it to Max the way he had once drilled recruits. Firm commands, clear expectations, and repetition until instinct replaced hesitation. Sit, stay, come, guard. The words were simple, but the weight behind them was unyielding. Max responded with an eagerness that surprised even Frank. Within months, the pup had grown into a young dog whose loyalty was as sharp as his instincts. The bond between man and animal was not the playful companionship others might have expected. There were no games of fetch, no casual strolls through the park. Instead, there was structure. Each morning began with a patrol of the property. Each evening ended with Max sitting at the foot of the porch while Frank smoked in silence. They ate at the same times, moved in the same rhythms, and rarely strayed from their routines. For Max, the world outside the fences did not exist. For Frank, the dog became both shield and companion, an extension of himself that filled the space where words might have gone. The neighborhood grew accustomed to the sight of them. When Frank walked Max along the edge of the property, the leash taut and the dog's ears alert, no one dared approach. When Frank went into town for supplies, Max remained behind the gate, pacing with military precision until his master returned. Their lives were measured, ordered, and unyielding, shaped by discipline and mutual dependence. Frank gave Max a home and a purpose. Max gave Frank loyalty without question, a kind of trust the old man had not felt from another soul in years. There were moments, though, when the mask of discipline slipped. In the quiet hours after midnight, when the town lay asleep and the crickets filled the air with their constant rhythm, Frank would rest in his chair and Max would climb onto the porch beside him. In those moments, Frank's hand would find the thick fur at the back of the dog's neck, his rough fingers moving slowly, almost absently. Max would close his eyes, leaning into the touch, and the growl that had become his language to the world softened into a low, steady breath. Those who lived nearby never saw it. They knew only the rigid figure and the dog's menacing stance. But in the solitude of the porch, man and dog shared something gentler, something that belonged only to them. Frank never spoke much about his time in the service. When asked, he deflected with short answers or changed the subject. But the discipline with which he raised Max, the sharpness in his commands, and the guarded way he moved through the world told the story for him. He had seen enough betrayal and loss to know the value of loyalty. He had learned to build walls where others might build bridges. And in Max, he found not only a companion but a reflection of himself, loyal, watchful, unyielding, and unwilling to bend for anyone outside the gate. Together, they became a pair no one dared disturb. The house was theirs, The hill was theirs, and the silence was theirs. Whatever the world thought, whatever the neighbors whispered, Frank and Max lived by a simple truth. Trust few, protect what is yours, and never let down your guard. It was a truth forged in war and carried into old age, a truth that shaped a man and his dog into the guardians of a house that seemed as impenetrable as they were. Fear as a way of spreading, without needing to be taught. In the neighborhood at the foot of the hill, it settled around Max like a second shadow. The children were the first to feel it. They learned quickly that the shortcut home from school was not worth the risk of passing the old house. When the fence rattled and Max's growl poured out like thunder, little hands tightened on bicycle handlebars and small feet picked up speed. Parents, noticing the way their children arrived home flushed and out of breath, told them to avoid Birchwood Lane altogether. But the warnings were rarely necessary. The children already knew. The sound of Max's bark had carved itself into their memories, a signal that sent them scattering like startled birds. For the mailman, mornings brought a ritual of dread. He never lingered as he approached the rusted gate. Letters and envelopes were pulled from his satchel with hurried fingers, shoved through the narrow slot before Max's teeth snapped inches away on the other side. Some days, the growl began long before he reached the house, a low rumble building from the shadows of the porch as if the dog could sense his approach. The mailman told stories at the depot, shaking his head and swearing that one day the beast would break through. The others laughed, but uneasily, knowing the stories held more truth than exaggeration. Delivery workers felt it too. Young men carrying boxes from the hardware store or grocery deliveries moved quickly, their eyes darting to the gate as Max tracked every step. He would pace, shoulders low, hackles raised, his growl deepening when they came too close. No one ever dared set a package directly on the porch. Instead, they left parcels at the end of the walkway, shouted a quick word toward the house, and hurried back to their trucks, doors slamming with relief. For them, Max was not just a guard dog, but a living barrier, a creature that made the property feel impenetrable. Even casual passers-by found themselves altering their paths. Couples out for evening walks would cross the street as soon as the outline of the house came into view. Joggers slowed their pace, choosing the longer loop around the neighborhood rather than risk the encounter. Teenagers, bold with the kind of courage that comes from not knowing real danger, tested their luck sometimes. They would approach the fence at night, laughing, daring one another to touch the gate. But when Max lunged from the shadows, his snarl ripping through the dark, their laughter broke into shouts of fear as they stumbled back, hearts pounding. By the time they regrouped, the courage had already drained from their faces, and they told each other they wouldn't try again. The fear was not only of his teeth, it was of his eyes. Those amber eyes followed every movement, unblinking, assessing. People said he could see through you, that he knew what you were thinking before you did. There was something in his stare that felt more than animal, a weight that made even grown men uneasy. It was a kind of look that reminded people of their own vulnerability, as if the fence was not there to keep Max in, but to keep them out. Over time, the house and its guardian became part of the neighborhood's folklore. Children swapped exaggerated stories. How Max once snapped a tree branch in two with his jaws, how he leapt so high his paws cleared the gate, how his growl could be heard 3 streets away on a still night. Adults, for all their reason, didn't dismiss the tales outright. They shook their heads and told each other that the dog was dangerous, that one day something terrible would happen. Some quietly suggested calling animal control, but no one wanted to be the one to take on Frank or his beast. Fear turned into habit. The sidewalk across the street became the preferred path. Parents instructed babysitters never to walk past the house with the children. Cyclists dismounted and wheeled their bikes in silence until they had passed the gate. It was easier to adjust than to challenge the presence that had claimed that corner of the neighborhood. And yet, beneath the fear, there was something else, a grudging respect, almost admiration, for the dog's absolute loyalty. He did not bark aimlessly or run wild. He guarded with purpose, with discipline, as though he understood exactly what his role was. In some unspoken way, the neighbors recognized that he was not just a dog, but a reflection of the man who owned him. Together, they formed an image of control and defiance, an island apart from the community, untouchable and unapproachable. The fear lingered, settling into the rhythm of daily life. It became part of the neighborhood's identity, a story parents told newcomers, a warning passed from one generation of children to the next. To live on Birchwood Lane was to know that the old house on the hill was off limits, that the dog at the gate would never greet you with wagging tail or friendly bark. For years, that truth remained unquestioned. No one believed it could change. Max was the growl in the morning, the bark in the night, the barrier between the world and the house he guarded. And the neighborhood accepted it, even as they crossed the street and lowered their voices each time they passed. Every day began the same way. As the first light of dawn crept over Birchwood Lane, Max was already awake, standing near the rusted gate as if the night had not ended. He moved with precision, circling the fence line with the patience of sentry, his paws pressed into the same narrow trail he had carved over years of repetition, a beaten path that wound through the weeds and dirt along the inside edge of the yard. The rhythm of the patrol was as steady as the ticking of a clock. Forward to the corner post, paused to sniff the air, back to the center, ears pricked, eyes never resting. The gate was his post, the narrow opening between his world and everything outside it. From there, he studied the street with an intensity that unsettled those who passed. He did not lounge or sprawl lazily like other dogs. He stood tall, head lifted, shoulders tight, his amber eyes following every motion beyond the fence. A fluttering leaf, a bicycle wheel, the sound of footsteps. Nothing escaped him. He was a watcher, and nothing crossed into his territory without being measured against a low growl that rumbled in his throat. The mailman always appeared just after sunrise, and Max knew the sound of his truck before it turned the corner. The moment the tires crunched gravel, Max positioned himself directly behind the gate, body taut, ready. As the man approached with his satchel, Max would let out a deep growl, the kind that made the hand delivering letters tremble ever so slightly. The envelope slid through the slot quickly, followed by a muttered curse or nervous laugh, and the man would retreat down the walk as Max pressed his nose against the iron, his breath fogging in the morning chill. Later came the joggers, their sneakers tapping rhythm against the pavement. They tried not to look, but Max's stare drew their eyes. His head moved in sync with their stride, his gaze unblinking. Some of them crossed the street well before reaching the house, unwilling to feel that piercing attention on them. Those who didn't hurry their pace often regretted it. When Max lunged suddenly against the gate, the iron rattled, and the echo of his bark carried through the still morning air like thunder. Even the boldest joggers quickened their pace, their calm broken by the reminder that the fence was the only barrier between them and his teeth. Throughout the day, Max never strayed far from his post. Delivery drivers found him waiting, as though he had known the exact time they would arrive. Children walking home from school caught sight of him, pacing back and forth, his head level with the top of the gate. He was tireless, his body trained into vigilance. He did not allow himself to rest until Frank, sitting on the porch, called him back with a low whistle. Even then, Max would hesitate, casting one more long look at the street before retreating to sit by the steps, his eyes never fully leaving the world beyond the fence. There was no distinction in his suspicion. Old or young, loud or quiet, familiar or unknown, it made no difference. To Max, the world outside was not to be trusted. A neighbor with friendly intentions was watched the same as a stranger who lingered too long. His loyalty had no room for nuance. The house was his, Frank was his, and the line drawn by the gate was the one he never allowed anyone to cross. At night, the routine did not end. Streetlights cast long shadows across the lane, and Max's silhouette appeared just behind the gate, unmoving for long stretches of time. He blended with the darkness, only his eyes catching the light when someone passed too close. The growl was quieter than, almost a hum, but no less unsettling. Those who braved the walk after dark swore it felt like being measured by something more than an animal, something that understood more than it should. To Frank, this routine was comfort. He watched his dog with quiet satisfaction, knowing that nothing could approach the house unseen. For him, Max was both shield and companion, the one presence that filled the silence with purpose. But to the neighborhood, Max became the gate itself, as if the old iron was animated by a suspicion. The street might be quiet, the house still, but those who passed never forgot the figure at the threshold. pacing with endless patience. Max lived for the gate. It was his stage, his duty, his reason. Day after day, season after season, he returned to it as faithfully as the sun rose. The world beyond never earned his trust, and so he kept it all at a distance, watching, waiting, ready. For years, that was all he knew, and no one ever thought it would be different. Until one day, as he stood in his place, something stirred in him that no growl could contain. Max's story did not begin at the gate or in the shadow of the old house. It began in a forgotten alley behind a hardware store, on a damp evening when the last of the daylight faded and the town's streets grew quiet. He was a bundle of fur then, small enough to fit into the crook of an arm, trembling against the cold concrete. Someone had left him there, ribs showing beneath matted fur, eyes wide with the kind of fear that only abandonment teaches. People passed by without stopping, or paused only long enough to shake their heads before moving on. A stray was just another problem in a world already full of them. But Frank stopped. The old veteran had not planned on bringing anything home that night. His errands had been simple: nails, oil, a new handle for the broken rake. Yet when he saw the pup curled in the shadows, something in him shifted. He crouched down, the smoke from his half-burnt cigarette curling into the air, and studied the little creature. The dog growled then, a sound so small it barely reached Frank's ears, but it was there, the instinct to protect even when there was nothing left to defend. It reminded him of himself, of nights when he had stood alone in places far from home, clutching a rifle in the dark and daring the world to test him. Without another word, Frank scooped the pup into his coat and carried him up the hill. From the beginning, Max's life was measured in rules. Frank fed him at the same times each day, set boundaries within the yard, and spoken commands that were short and sharp. Sit, heel, guard. The pup learned quickly, eager to please the only figure who had offered him a second chance. The bond formed not in softness but in structure, in the steady rhythm of discipline that gave the dog both purpose and security. When Max obeyed, he was rewarded with food, with a firm hand pressed to his head, with a quiet approval in Frank's eyes. When he strayed, the correction was swift and firm, never cruel, but enough to remind him that obedience was survival. The outside world faded quickly from Max's concern. Strangers were not to be trusted. Their voices, their scents, their movements, none of it mattered. What mattered was Frank, the man whose presence was constant, whose commands were absolute. Max began to see the world the way Frank saw it, divided into the safe and the unsafe, into what belonged inside the fence and what threatened from outside. Loyalty became instinct. Suspicion became second nature. As the pup grew into a young dog, Frank tested him. He brought him to the edge of the gate when delivery men arrived, watching how Max reacted. The dog's growl came easily, his body stiff, his eyes sharp. He lunged at the iron bars, teeth bared, sending the men back with hurried steps. Frank said nothing at first, only nodded, his cigarette glowing faintly in approval. Later, he would kneel and scratch behind Max's ears, a rare gesture of affection that said more than words ever could. The message was clear: trust no one, protect what is yours, and never falter. In time, Max became an extension of Frank's own isolation. The veteran had no family nearby, no friends who came calling. The house was quiet, the rooms echoing with the absence of laughter or conversation. But Max filled the silence. He filled it not with noise, but with presence, with a steady sound of paws across the floorboards, with the low hum of his breathing on the porch at night, with the unyielding shadow that followed Frank wherever he went. To the man who had learned long ago that loyalty was rare and fleeting, the dog was proof that it could still exist, if only within the narrow borders of his own property. Years passed, and Max's loyalty hardened into something unbreakable. The boyish features of the pup disappeared, replaced by the strong frame of a German shepherd whose very stance commanded caution. His growl deepened into a sound that carried through the neighborhood, warning all who came too close. Yet beneath the menace, his heart beat only for one man. No amount of coaxing, no kindness from strangers, no attempt at friendship could draw him away from Frank. He had been rescued once, and that was enough. His devotion was absolute, and it was not for sharing. By the time the town came to know him as the beast behind the gate, Max's life had already been shaped by years of this singular loyalty. He did not chase for play. He did not bark for attention. Everything he did, the patrols, the growls, the stares, was born of one truth. Frank had given him a place when no one else would. And in return, Max gave him everything he had. It was a life of obedience, yes, but it was also a life of fierce devotion, a bond carved out of discipline and solitude. And so, when people whisper about the dog who trusted no one, they were right. Max belonged to Frank and to no one else. The world beyond the fence was nothing more than something to be watched, something to be held at bay. His loyalty was his world. It would remain so until the day ascent on the wind stirred something buried deep within him, something older than training, something that no command could suppress. It began in small conversations, the kind exchanged over fences or while waiting at the crosswalk. A mother pulling her child by the hand muttered to another parent about the dog on the hill, her voice low but edged with fear. A group of joggers, gathered near the corner to stretch, spoke about how they had changed their route just to avoid passing the gate. The more Max grew into his role, the more the whispers spread. At first, they were only stories, the kind people tell to pass time, but slowly they became warnings and complaints and finally debates. At the coffee shop near Main Street, his name came up often. Customers leaned across chip tables, stirring sugar into steaming cups, while one person after another recounted an encounter. A delivery driver swore Max had nearly broken to the gate one morning when he dropped off a package. He told the story with shaking hands, describing the teeth that flashed inches from his arm, the way the iron bars rattled under the force of the lunge. Others nodded, trading their own uneasy tales. The bark that jolted them in the night, the way his eyes seemed to follow them long after they had passed. Parents were the loudest voices. They worried about the children, who, no matter how many warnings were given, still tested their courage by daring each other to creep close to the fence. One boy had fallen from his bike when Max's bark startled him, scraping his knee badly enough to need stitches. That incident became the story retold at every neighborhood gathering, always growing in detail, always ending with someone saying, "Next time, it could be worse." Fear was a seed, and repetition watered it until it grew into something impossible to ignore. Some neighbors defended Max, insisting that he was only doing what he had been trained to do. They pointed to Frank, who never let the dog roam freely, who kept him inside the gate, who clearly cared for the animal with the discipline of a soldier. "He's not dangerous if you respect the boundary," one man argued. "That dog knows his job. Leave him alone and you'll have no trouble." But those voices were softer, drowned out by the rising chorus of concern. For many, it was not enough to be told the fence was secure. They wanted reassurance that the growl they heard in their dreams could never one day break into reality. The whispers grew louder when animal control was mentioned. It began as a suggestion, timidly offered by a mother at the school board meeting after recounting the bike incident. "I'm not saying the dog should be taken away," she said carefully, "but shouldn't we at least have someone check? To make sure the fence is strong? To make sure he isn't a danger?" Others nodded, their fear easing now that a solution had been spoken aloud. Soon the idea spread. Letters were drafted. Complaints filed anonymously. Requests for inspection slipped into envelopes and sent to the city office. Not everyone agreed. Of course. Some muttered that people were overreacting, that fear had clouded judgment. But even they admitted in quieter moments that there was something unsettling about the way Max never softened, never wagged his tail at passerby, never barked playfully like other dogs. He was a constant reminder of separation, of suspicion, of something inhuman in his discipline. In their hearts, many wondered whether the line between guardian and danger had already blurred. Frank knew of the whispers. He caught the way neighbors lowered their voices when he stepped into the store, how eyes turned toward him when he bought sacks of dog food. He heard the rumors from the clerk, who confided that people had been talking to city officials. Yet he said nothing. He walked home with the weight of it pressing on his shoulders, lit another cigarette on the porch, and watched Max pacing the gate as if the world outside had already betrayed them. In the evenings, the whispers took on sharper edges. Some called the dog a menace. Others spoke of lawsuits, of what might happen if someone was bitten, "It's only a matter of time," a father said as he raked leaves into neat piles. "That dog will hurt someone. You'll see." The sound of Max's bark carried down the lane just then, a hollow echo rolling over the rooftops, and the father paused, staring toward the hill as though expecting the worst. The community found itself divided between fear and respect, between those who saw Max as a threat and those who saw him as a protector. But beneath every opinion ran the same undercurrent: unease. Max was more than just a dog. He had become a symbol of the unknown, a reminder of danger that could not be reasoned with. And though the whispers had not yet turned into action, it was only a matter of time before someone demanded more than talk. The old house on the hill sat quiet through it all, its windows dark, its gate rattling whenever Max lunged forward at a passing figure. The neighbors kept their distance, but their voices carried, reaching into living rooms and kitchens, turning worry into resolve. Somewhere between caution and fear, a decision was forming. For the first time, the question was not whether Max would attack, but when and whether they would wait until it happened to do something about it. It was an ordinary afternoon, the kind where the air felt heavy with summer heat, and the sound of cicadas seemed to press against every corner of the neighborhood. Children had been let out of school not long before, their shouts and laughter carrying across the streets as bicycles clicked and clattered over uneven pavement. Down on Birchwood Lane, the quiet stretch beneath the old house, one boy rode slower than the rest. His bike was a hand-me-down from his older brother, the paint scratched, the handlebars taped where the rubber grips had torn. He wasn't supposed to take this road. His mother had warned him more than once to keep clear of the house on the hill, but shortcuts are hard to resist when you're 12 and restless, and the slope of Birchwood made for an easy coast. He pedaled with one hand on the bar, the other holding a plastic bag with a comic book and a bottle of soda rattling inside. The afternoon light cut across his face, sweat glistening on his brow as the tires hummed against the cracked asphalt. At first, he thought nothing of the gate ahead. It was just another part of the neighborhood, the same as it had always been, though the stories about the dog had circled around him for months. Still, he had never seen Max up close. Curiosity, sharp and stubborn, pushed him forward. The iron bars of the gate loomed larger as he approached, and at first the yard beyond looked empty. He relaxed his grip, letting the bike roll faster, thinking maybe the others had exaggerated. Maybe the dog wasn't as fearsome as they claimed. Then came the sound, low, rising from the ground itself, a growl that made the hair on his arms stand straight. From the shadows of the porch, Max appeared, moving fast, shoulders rolling with controlled power. His eyes locked on the boy, and the growl deepened into something primal, something that vibrated in the boy's chest before his ears fully caught it. Startled, he jerked the handlebars too sharply, the front tire catching on a patch of uneven pavement. The bike wobbled once, then pitched sideways. The boy hit the ground hard, grass scraping against his skin as the soda burst from the bag and rolled down the slope. His comic book flew open, pages bending in the dirt. For a moment, he just lay there, wind knocked from his chest, staring wide-eyed at the fence where Max pressed forward, teeth bared, barking now with full force. The sound filled the lane, each slam of Max's body against the iron gate rattling through the boy's bones. He scrambled backward on his hands and feet, the bike lying twisted beside him. His heart hammered, as though it might break free from his ribs. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs would not yet obey. The dog's bark was not the mindless noise of excitement. It was controlled, deliberate, the language of warning. The boy felt it in the ground, in the air, in his chest. A door creaked open on the porch, and Frank's voice cut through the chaos. It wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of command. Max froze mid-bark, muscles still tense, eyes fixed on the boy. At another sharp word, the dog pulled back, pacing once along the fence before retreating toward the porch. The silence that followed was almost worse than the sound. The boy could still hear the echo in his head, could still feel the tremor in his limbs. Frank stood at the top of the steps, his cigarette forgotten in his hand, eyes narrowed as he watched the boy gather himself. He didn't call out, didn't ask if the child was hurt. He only watched, his expression unreadable, while the boy pushed his bike upright with trembling hands. The chain had slipped, the wheel bent, But none of that mattered. All he wanted was distance, space between himself and those amber eyes that still seemed to burn from the shadows. Neighbors came out onto porches, drawn by the noise. A few hurried to the boy's side, checking the scrapes on his knees and the trembling in his voice. He tried to speak, but the words came out in broken gasps. They helped him steady the bike, led him away down the lane, their glances darting toward the house as if expecting Max to lunge again. Whisper voices carried in the air. That dog is too dangerous. It could have been worse. Someone needs to do something. From his porch, Frank lit his cigarette again, the tip glowing faintly as the smoke drifted upward. He said nothing to the gathering below, nothing to the boy limping away with his neighbors. Max sat at his feet, calm now, ears twitching but body relaxed, as though nothing had happened. To Frank, it was another reminder that the dog had done exactly what he was meant to do: defend, warn, protect. But to the neighborhood, it was proof that the whispers of danger were no longer whispers. The boy's scraped knees and frightened eyes were enough to turn caution into anger, enough to make the people at the bottom of the hill wonder whether fear alone could keep them safe any longer. The lane quieted again after a while, but the memory lingered. The boy would carry it home. His mother would hear the story, and by the next morning, the whole town would know. On Birchwood Lane, the house on the hill seemed darker, and the shadow at the gate more menacing than ever. Frank had heard the mutterings long before the boy with the bike ever fell on the grass. Whispers carried easily in a neighborhood where porches leaned close to the street and windows stayed cracked open in the evenings. They thought he didn't hear, but he always did. The talk was never about him, not directly. It was always about Max too mean, too dangerous, too unpredictable. And yet, Frank knew those words were aimed at him as much as a dog at his side. A man is judged by the company he keeps, and in his case, the company was a guard dog who growled at anything that moved. After the accident with the boy, the talk wasn't whispers anymore. It became voices spoken in daylight, muttered across fences, said aloud in the grocery store, while Frank stood in line 2 aisles over. One neighbor shook his head when he passed. Another avoided his gaze altogether. A few brave ones muttered that animal control should be called before something worse happened. No one dared walk up his drive and say it to his face. But Frank didn't need them to. He had spent years reading people in silence. He could tell by the shift of their shoulders, by the stiffness in their smiles, by the way parents gripped their children's hands when they walked past the old house on the hill. Yet when anyone did confront him, even in passing, he found himself defending Max without hesitation. "That dog is loyal," he would say, the words spoken low and steady. "He's not dangerous, not unless you try to be." It wasn't an argument, more a statement, like reciting something carved into stone. He told himself, and anyone who would listen, that Max had never bitten a soul, never crossed a line between warning and harm. But loyalty is a word that sounds different depending on who hears it. To Frank, it meant a creature who had stood by him in silence when no one else did, a presence as steady as breath. To the neighbors, it meant something else, a blind devotion that could turn vicious in a moment. Frank never shouted when he defended Max. He never raised his voice or tried to force the issue. He had lived too long to think volume would change minds. Instead, he spoke with the quiet certainty of a man who believed that loyalty was the highest proof of character. But each time he did, he also felt the gulf widen between himself and everyone else. They didn't see Max the way he did. They saw sharp teeth behind an iron gate. He saw the shivering pup he had lifted from the cold years ago, the one who had leaned into his hands with trust after everything else had failed him. At night, when the house was silent and Max lay at the foot of his chair, Frank allowed himself to acknowledge what he would never say aloud. He was alone. The world beyond his fence had grown smaller, more suspicious, and every defenseless dog only deepened the sense of separation. It wasn't that he doubted Max. It was that he understood the truth the neighbors did not care to admit. Trust in a creature like Max came from history, from years of shared moments, from commands obeyed and promises kept. Outsiders couldn't see that. They couldn't feel it. And so, in their eyes, Frank had become an outsider too. The veterans at the diner where he sometimes had coffee gave him nods of respect, but kept conversation short. The postman no longer lingered at the box. Even children who once waved from across the street now looked away when he returned the gesture. None of it changed the bond he had with Max, but reminded him, over and over, that loyalty had come at a price. He sat most evenings on the porch, cigarette glowing faintly in the dusk, watching Max patrol the yard. The dog would pause at the gate, ears alert, eyes steady on the world beyond, then circle back toward the porch as though checking to be sure Frank was still there. Frank found comfort in that routine, even as he felt the weight of the stairs and the shadows below the hill. He told himself it didn't matter if no one else understood. What mattered was that Max did. What mattered was that he wasn't truly alone, not as long as the dog's watchful presence remained. Still, as smoke curled upward into the dim sky, he felt the sharp edge of isolation pressing closer. He remembered comrades lost in war, friends long buried, the slow dwindling of voices around him. Max was the last constant. If he lost that, there would be nothing left. And so, Frank's defense was not just about a dog. It was about clinging to the one bond that still gave shape to his life. To surrender Max would be to admit that even loyalty could be taken, that even the most steadfast companion could be stripped away by people who saw only danger where he saw devotion. That, Frank thought, would be the final defeat. The evenings were always the same, and that sameness gave them their comfort. As the sun slid low behind the tree line, painting the sky in muted orange and purple, Frank would ease himself into the wooden chair on the porch, its arms smooth from years of use. Max would settle nearby, sometimes at his feet, sometimes a little farther out where he could watch the fence and the darkening road. They didn't need to look at each other to acknowledge presence. The weight of company was enough, a silent agreement between two beings who had seen the years stretch long and quiet. Frank no longer moved quickly. His hands were knotted with time, his steps measured, and he carried the heaviness of old battles in his bones. Max carried his years differently, though they showed just as plainly. His once-jet coat had streaks of gray along the muzzle, his eyes clouded slightly at the edges, and his legs stiffened when he rose too quickly. But his spirit, that sharp alertness that defined him, remained unbroken. Together, they were not what they once had been, but they understood each other in ways that required no words. There was a rhythm to their evenings. Frank would pour a small glass of whiskey, never more than one, and light a cigarette that burned slowly as the crickets began their chorus. Max would lie with his head on his paws, ears twitching at the smallest sounds. The rustle of leaves, a car far down the hill, a voice carried faintly on the wind. Each sound met with a flick of the ear or a brief growl, then silence again. In those moments, Frank often wondered if Max was protecting him, or if Max simply needed something to guard to keep meaning in his days. Perhaps it was both. The loneliness was heavy, but not unbearable. Frank had lived long enough with solitude to know its edges, to know how to sit with it without letting it swallow him. Max helped with that. There was a companionship in having someone beside him who asked for nothing but presence. The dog never pressed him for words, never demanded explanations, never judged him for his silences. That kind of company had become rare in Frank's life. He remembered the noise of barracks, the laughter of friends now gone, the sound of his wife's voice once filling this very porch with warmth. All of it had receded into memory, but Max stayed, and that was enough to hold the evenings together. Sometimes Frank spoke, not expecting a reply, but knowing Max would hear. He would murmur about the day, about the aches in his knees, about the weather turning, or about nothing in particular at all. Max would lift his head, eyes steady, as though listening. Other times, silence hung between them, thick but not uncomfortable. In that silence, they shared something deeper than words. It was a recognition of two creatures bound by loyalty, both of them weathered, both of them carrying histories that others could not see. The world beyond the fence seemed distant in those hours. Neighbors walked by but never lingered. Cars slowed as they passed the hill but rarely stopped. Frank was aware of the murmurs, of the reputation Max carried. But up on the porch, with the dog stretched beside him, those judgments seemed far away. Here, there was only the creak of the chair, the glow of the cigarette, and the steady presence of a creature who had walked every year of the last decade with him. Max's head sometimes rested against Frank's boot, the warmth of his body seeping into the old leather. In those moments, Frank felt something close to peace. Age had stripped him of many things: friends, family, strength, but had given him an appreciation for stillness. To sit with a loyal dog as the world moved on without him was not a loss, but a strange kind of grace. He thought often about how much harder the evenings would feel if he had no one at all waiting for him at the door. As the night deepened, the stars came out one by one, scattered across the dark sky. Frank would finish his drink, stub out the cigarette, and slowly push himself up from the chair. Max would rise too, slower now than in younger days, but steady. They would go inside together, leaving the porch to its silence, carrying the weight of another day behind them. No one else saw those moments. No one else understood them. But to Frank, they were proof that he was not entirely alone, that loyalty could endure even when the years grew long. The knock on the front gate came one late morning, sharp and deliberate, the kind that carried authority. Max was there before Frank could even shift his chair, his body pressed against the fence, his growl vibrating low and steady. Dust rose beneath his paws as he lunged once, teeth flashing through the slats, making it clear to whoever stood beyond that entry was not an option. Frank eased himself up from the porch with the help of his cane, his knees stiff, the weight of irritation already heavy in his chest. He had learned long ago the difference between casual knocks and official ones. This was no neighbor. On the other side of the fence stood a man in a pressed shirt and tie, holding a clipboard under one arm and keeping a careful distance from the gate. He introduced himself quickly, voice clipped and formal, announcing that he was with the city inspector's office. His eyes did not stay on Frank for long. They shifted nervously toward Max, who had planted himself like a sentinel, barking in deep bursts that rattled the boards. The inspector flinched at each sound, though he tried not to show it. His hand tightened around the clipboard as if it were a shield. Frank rested his hands on the top of the fence, leaning slightly forward. His voice was even but rough with age as he asked what the business was. The inspector cleared his throat and explained. There had been complaints, he said, more than a few, regarding the dog. Neighbors had reported constant growling, intimidation, even an incident with a boy on a bike. The words were spoken carefully, as if he knew each one was laying stone on a pile that could soon tip. He emphasized that while Max was on private property, the concern was his threat to those passing by. Frank's jaw tightened, but he said nothing at first. He listened to the formal language of policy, of warnings and citations. He had heard such tones before in different uniforms, under different circumstances, where authority dressed itself in calm words but carried an unspoken weight. When the inspector finally paused, Frank asked if the complaints had named anyone injured. The man shook his head, admitting that no one had been bitten, no blood drawn, no proof of violence beyond fear. Still, he explained, the fear itself was enough. The city had rules, and rules had to be enforced. Max continued pacing at the gate, his eyes never leaving the stranger. Frank reached down and laid a weathered hand on his back, the touch enough to quiet the growl to a low rumble. He told the inspector that Max had lived there for years, had never left the yard, and had been nothing but loyal. He pointed out that fear was often a matter of perception, not reality. Some people were simply uneasy around dogs, especially one of Max's size and presence. That didn't make him dangerous. The inspector listened, but his expression remained steady, professional. He explained that this was a final caution. If more complaints came in, or if another incident occurred, animal control could be involved. That would mean hearings, fines, perhaps even removal of the dog. His voice softened then, almost apologetic, as if he understood the bond between man and animal, but policy gave him little room. He handed Frank a folded notice, its edges crisp, its words printed in official ink that left no space for argument. Frank took the paper without looking at it, his hand firm despite the tremor of age. He folded it once more and slipped it into his pocket, unwilling to give the inspector the satisfaction of seeing him study it. He told the man that Max was not going anywhere, that this house was just a guard, and that he would answer to no one else. The inspector sighed, nodding as though he expected as much, then stepped back from the gate with visible relief as Max surged forward again, barking until his voice cracked the air. When the man was gone, the sound of his footsteps fading down the hill, Frank remained by the fence for a long moment, his hand still resting on Max's back. He felt the strength of the dog beneath his palm, the steadiness that had carried him through so many years of solitude. Yet, in the silence that followed, he could not shake the weight of the warning. He had always known that neighbors whispered, that people feared what they did not understand. But to see it pressed into words on official paper made it harder to dismiss. He finally turned, walking slowly back to the porch. Max followed, head high, as if proud of having sent the stranger away. Frank lowered himself into his chair, staring out at the empty road, the folded notice heavy in his pocket. For the first time, the quiet of his evenings no longer felt entirely safe. The bond between him and Max remained unshaken, but the world beyond the fence had begun pressing harder against her solitude, and Frank could feel the edge of intrusion creeping closer with every complaint. The storm rolled in with a heaviness that seemed to press against every rooftop in town, a low growl of thunder rising in the distance long before the rain began. Frank felt it in his bones, the ache in his knees announcing the weather's arrival before the first drop hit the ground. By evening, the sky had darkened to a bruised gray, and the wind cut through the trees, bending them low and rattling the old shutters on the house. The smell of rain, sharp and metallic, clung to the air as Max paced along the porch, ears pricked, body tense. He seemed to sense the storm as a threat, not of water or wind, but of something else unseen, moving in the shadows between each strike of lightning. When the first crack of thunder split the night, Max let out a sound deeper than his usual bark, a low growl that seemed to crawl out of his chest. His eyes glowed briefly in the flash that followed, reflecting the jagged streaks of lightning that tore across the sky. Frank sat in his chair, shoulders wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, and watched his dog pace back and forth, never once taking his gaze off the fence that separated their yard from the darkness beyond. The storm was loud, violent, but it was not what Max was growling at. It was the way the night seemed alive with movement, as if the storm had brought with it restless spirits that wandered too close to the property. Rain began hammering the roof, pouring down in sheets that turned the world beyond the porch into a blur of shifting shadows. The old gutters overflowed almost immediately, sending waterfalls crashing to the ground, soaking the earth into mud. Each gust of wind carried with it the clatter of branches striking the house, the slam of loose boards on the fence, and the eerie sound of metal gates down the street banging open and shut. Every noise was met with Max's answering growl, his body stiff, hackles raised, teeth flashing white whenever the lightning revealed him. He was relentless, prowling the length of the porch, head swinging, nose raised as if to sniff out intruders that might be cloaked by the storm. Frank, for all his calm exterior, felt a flicker of unease. He knew Max was not spooked by ordinary storms. The dog had weathered many nights like this, content to sit by his side while the world thundered overhead. Tonight was different. Tonight Max was alert, almost frantic, as though he sensed something outside the realm of wind and rain. Frank leaned forward in his chair, his cane resting against the armrest, and spoke the dog's name in a steady voice. Max paused for a moment, glanced back at him, then returned his eyes to the yard. The storm gave no room for reassurance. The thunder grew louder, rolling through the valley like cannon fire, shaking the walls and floorboards. The old house trembled under the strain, its timbers groaning, its windows rattling in their frames. Frank thought of the inspector's visit, the neighbors' whispers, the constant complaints. On nights like this, with the world outside raging, he felt the fragility of his solitude. Yet, as Max growled and barked into the storm, Frank also felt the iron wall of loyalty that had stood beside him all these years. A crash split the air, something heavier than a branch this time. Max barked furiously, lunging to the edge of the porch, teeth snapping at the storm. Frank gripped the arms of his chair, peering into the downpour, for a moment illuminated by lightning. He thought he saw a figure at the edge of the yard, a shadow that vanished as quickly as it appeared. He blinked, unsure if it was his eyes playing tricks or something real. Max, however, had no such doubts. His bark was wild, his body straining against an invisible line, ready to defend the fence with everything in him. The rain drummed on, relentless, soaking the earth until it seemed the yard itself was drowning. Still, Max did not falter. His eyes tracked every movement, his body tense and unwavering. Frank whispered him again, softer this time, not to calm him but to remind himself that he was not alone. Outside, the storm raged like a living thing, but inside the boundary of the old house on the hill, there remained the unshakable presence of a dog who saw every shadow, heard every sound, and refused to let anything cross that gate. As the hours dragged on, thunder fading only to return, Frank stayed awake with Max, listening to the storm's chaos and watching the lightning carve brief windows into the night. The inspector's warnings, the neighbor's fear, the isolation of his life, all seemed small against the simple truth of what he saw before him. A dog whose growl was not menace, but devotion, fierce and unwavering. When dawn finally broke, gray and heavy, the storm moved on with the first pale light. Max remained at the gate, soaked, vigilant, his eyes still cutting through the morning mist as though the storm had left something behind. The morning after the storm carried with it a heavy silence, the kind that seems to settle when the world is still drying itself. The grass was soaked, bending under the weight of water, and the air smelled of wet earth and splintered wood. Frank moved slowly along the porch, cane tapping against the boards, while Max lingered near the gate, his body rigid, eyes trained on the road that curved down the hill. His ears twitched with every distant sound, the rumble of a car's engine far off, the drip of water falling from a gutter, the creak of a branch still dangling loose from the storm. Then came a noise that neither of them expected, the sharp, deliberate sound of knuckles rapping against the iron bars of the gate. Max reacted instantly. His body surged forward, a growl tearing through his throat, deep and low, echoing through the damp air. His paws struck the muddy ground hard, sending droplets flying. As he pressed against the gate, teeth bared at the figure standing just beyond it. Frank froze at the sound, gripping his cane tighter, eyes narrowing toward the entrance. A stranger stood there, not in uniform, not like the inspector or delivery man, but dressed in plain clothes, worn jeans, a faded shirt, and a coat that looked as though it had seen years of use. His shoes were coated with the wet dust of the road, and under his arm he carried something long, wrapped in cloth, tied neatly with twine. The man didn't flinch at Max's growl. Instead, he stood calmly, eyes fixed on the animal as though studying him. There was no fear in his stance, no hurried retreat like the mailman or the boy on the bike. He simply waited, his free hand resting casually at his side. Max's growl grew louder, his chest heaving with each sound. But there was a hesitation in it too, a falter that Frank, sharp-eyed despite his age, noticed. Frank shifted his weight, taking a few steps closer to the edge of the porch, his voice gravelly as he called out, "You got some nerve standing there. People don't usually knock on this gate." The stranger nodded once, his expression unreadable, though there was a softness around his eyes that made him seem less threatening than the situation suggested. "I know," he answered simply. His voice carried easily through the damp air, steady and low. "I wouldn't come if it wasn't important." Max's growl wavered. His tail, stiff and high, lowered slightly, though his body remained braced against the gate. The stranger shifted the object under his arm, holding it a little higher, almost as though to show it. The cloth around it was damp from the night's rain, and its shape, though mostly hidden, hinted at something long and straight, perhaps wooden. Frank's eyes narrowed further, suspicion sparking in his chest. "You're trespassing," Frank said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of command from his years in uniform. "Whatever business you've got, say it from there." The man nodded again. "Fair enough. I'm not here to cause trouble." He glanced down at Max, whose growl had dropped into a low rumble, more uncertain now than fierce. "I think he remembers me." The words hit Frank like a jolt. He frowned, leaning more heavily on his cane as he studied the man. Max, who never eased for anyone, whose growl could cut through even the bravest, was hesitating. His ears twitched, his eyes fixed not on the stranger's face but on the sound of his voice. There was recognition there, buried under years of suspicion and training. The stranger shifted again, lifting the wrapped object just slightly. "I brought something," he said, careful, deliberate, "for him. For you." Frank didn't answer right away. He could feel the old boards of the porch creaking beneath his weight, the damp breeze brushing against his skin, the tension in Max's body ready to snap in either direction. Everything about the moment balanced on a thin line. The growl, The knock, the stranger standing calm and steady with a package under his arm. Frank's eyes searched for answers in the man's posture, in the hint of familiarity in his voice. He couldn't place him yet, but something in the way Max held himself told him this was no ordinary intruder. Max gave one final growl, sharp and commanding, then quieted, his body still pressed against the bars, but his ears tilted forward, listening. For the first time in years, the guard dog's suspicion gave way to something else. Curiosity, memory, a spark of recognition that unsettled Frank even more than the growl itself. The air seemed to thicken as the stranger remained still at the gate, his simple presence enough to ignite something fierce inside Max. Without warning, the deep rumble in the dog's chest erupted into a barrage of furious barks, each one cracking through the damp morning air like gunfire. His entire body surged against the iron bars, muscles rippling beneath his coarse coat, claws scraping grooves into wet earth as he lunged again and again. The clang of metal echoed with each impact, the old hinges groaning, as though even the gate itself could feel the force's rage. Droplets of spit flew from his teeth as he snapped at the air, jaws wide, sharp white fangs flashing like warning signals. Frank gripped his cane tighter, the scene unfolding before him both familiar and unsettling. He had seen Max bare his teeth at plenty of people before, mailmen, neighbors, even the boy on the bike. But there was something different this time. This was no measured warning, no routine display of power. This was raw, unrestrained fury. The dog's bark rolled in waves, vibrating through the fence, rattling in Frank's chest until it was almost impossible to tell where the growls ended and the echoes began. The stranger, for his part, did not step back. He stood his ground, the wrapped object still cradled under his arm, his face calm though the sound must have shaken him to the core. His eyes didn't flick away, didn't widen with fear. Instead, he watched Max with the patience of someone who had been here before, who knew what it meant when a dog tore the silence apart with its voice. His calmness only seemed to enrage Max further. The dog slammed his body against the bars so violently that they rattled in their stone posts. His claws ripped up clumps of grass and dirt as he scrambled to get closer, to break through the barrier that separated him from a man on the other side. Frank's voice cut through the chaos, low and sharp, though it was swallowed almost immediately by Max's fury. "Max, down!" he commanded, his old soldier's tone returning, strong despite the rasp in his throat. But Max didn't yield. His ears flattened, his body pressed forward again, and the barking swelled until it seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. Frank took a step forward, his cane thudding against the porch, anger and unease tightening in his chest. He had trained his dog with discipline, had conditioned him to listen above all else. But here was Max, lost in a storm of his own making, deaf to every order. Neighbors, alerted by the relentless sound, began peering from their windows. Curtains twitched, doors creaked open, and whispers spread to the street like wildfire. Some faces showed alarm, others a familiar disdain that always came when Max made himself known. A woman 2 houses down pulled her child closer, murmuring under her breath about calling animal control. The old fear of Max was reignited, and Frank felt it pressing in from all directions. Still, the stranger didn't move. His feet were rooted in the soft mud, his shoulders squared, his gaze locked on Max slowly, almost imperceptibly. He adjusted his grip on the wrapped item under his arm, but not in a way that suggested defense. He shifted it carefully, almost reverently, as though what he carried demanded protection even in the middle of chaos. Max's eyes flickered briefly to the movement, his barking breaking into a higher pitch, more frantic than before. He lunged again, teeth clashing against the bars, the sound sharp and metallic. Frank's heart pounded as he shouted again, louder this time, his voice carrying across the neighborhood. "Max, stand down." But his words dissolved into the cacophony. The dog was consumed, each bark more desperate, each growl deeper, as though torn from a place of recognition buried too far inside him to name. His body trembled with exertion, yet he refused to stop, straining so hard that for a moment Frank feared the gate might finally give way. The sight of Max like this unsettled Frank more than he cared to admit. He had built the dog into a fortress, into a shadow of discipline and loyalty, but never had he seen him unravel like this. It was as though the stranger's presence had cracked something open in him, something older than training, something wilder than routine. The veteran's eyes narrowed, his chest tight with a mixture of dread and a sliver of something else, something he didn't want to recognize as hope. The storm of growls raged on, echoing to the quiet street, a sound that refused to be ignored. It was no longer just the sound of a guard dog doing his duty. It was something deeper, stranger, almost primal. And though the stranger stood untouched behind the bars, his calm eyes fixed on Max, it was clear to Frank that this was not the usual warning to keep people away. This was a battle cry from somewhere within the dog's memory, one that neither the gate nor Frank's voice could silence. Frank's hand tightened around the worn grip of his cane as he stood on the porch, the din of Max's barking thundering in his ears. Each guttural snarl shook him in ways he hadn't expected, though he had lived with that sound for years. Usually, it was background noise, the familiar thunder of a loyal protector doing his duty. But this time, there was a raw edge in it, something jagged and unsettled, and Frank could not shake the feeling that it carried more meaning than simple hostility. His boots creaked on the old wooden steps as he descended slowly, his breath ragged in his chest. He was torn between two forces: the instinct to shield a stranger at the gate from his dog's fury, and the soldier's belief that Max's instincts were never wrong. The stranger had not moved, his calmness unnerving against the chaos of Max's growls. He stood firm, his figure framed by the rusted gate, the wrapped object tucked beneath his arm like some kind of offering. Frank's eyes flicked between the man's stillness and his dog's frenzy, the contradiction pressing on him like a weight he could not shake. Max had been trained to guard, yes, but more than that, he had been shaped by years of discipline to sense what Frank could not see. If the dog saw danger, was Frank a fool to dismiss it? Yet, something about the stranger's posture, his steady gaze, hinted at anything but malice. Frank's mind wrestled with memory. He recalled long patrols in foreign lands, the nights where silence was pierced by sudden alarm, and how often survival hinged on trusting an animal's warning. Dogs had saved soldiers' lives countless times, alerting them to mines, to ambushes, to the presence of enemies in shadows. That memory tugged at him now, whispering that Max's rage must mean something. But another thought, quieter and more painful, pulled at him as well. The knowledge that Max was aging, that years of conditioning might have hardened him into suspicion that no longer distinguished between friend and foe. Was the dog now simply a hammer striking at every nail, unable to tell the difference? Neighbors watched from their porches, their faces etched with curiosity and fear. Frank could feel their judgment pressing against him, just as much as Max's growls pressed against the iron bars. He could almost hear their unspoken words, that he had lost control, that the dangerous dog was finally proving them right. The city inspector's warning rang in his ears, the threat of animal control looming like a shadow on the edges of his thoughts. He knew every second Max rage was another mark against him, another reason for the neighborhood to call for his removal. His foot touched the damp earth, and he paused, the cane digging into the ground for support. "Easy, Max," he said, his voice softer now, trying to thread its way through the storm. But Max did not hear him, or chose not to. The dog's body was taut with fury, every muscle straining, eyes locked on the stranger as if the man carried the weight of every trespass ever made on the property. Frank took another step forward, closer to the gate, closer to the danger, his heart pounding with a rhythm that felt far too familiar. The stranger's eyes lifted briefly, meeting Frank's across the chaos. There was no fear in them, only a quiet recognition, as though he understood the hesitation eating at the old man. It was a look that seemed to say, "Let this play out." But Frank's instinct screamed at him to intervene, to force Max back, to take control before something irreversible happened. His mind raced with possibilities. If the gate gave way, if Max broke free, if the neighbors finally made a call that would take his companion away. He raised his voice again, this time with the clipped authority of the soldier he once was. "Max, enough." The words cut through the air but fell flat against the pounding rhythm of the growls. The dog's ears twitched, but his body remained forward, unrelenting, as if some deep memory was holding him in place. Frank's knuckles whitened on the cane as he stood frozen, caught between stepping fully into the fray or retreating to the porch. His loyalty to his dog battled with his responsibility to those outside the fence. He felt the eyes of the neighborhood on him, judging, waiting, as though this moment would decide not only Max's fate, but his own. The hesitation held him still, his chest tightening with the weight of indecision. Somewhere in a cacophony of barking and a patter of rain still dripping from the storm, Frank understood he was standing at a threshold. One path led to protecting the stranger by restraining his dog, undermining years of trust. The other meant trusting Max's judgment, whatever the cost. And so, cane pressing to the earth, shoulders tense, Frank did the only thing he could in that suspended moment. He waited, caught between two truths, his silence heavy, his hesitation almost as loud as Max's growls. The stranger did not move, not when Max's paws scraped the ground with the force of his lunges, not when the dog's teeth bared inches away from the gate's bars. The air was thick with the sound of snarls, every guttural growl echoing off the weathered fence, but the man stood steady, shoulders squared, as if rooted in place. His calmness was so unnatural that even the neighbors, watching from half-hidden windows, leaned forward, expecting him to stumble back or run. Yet he did neither. He simply watched, his eyes never breaking from Max's, as though the chaos before him were nothing more than a passing storm. Max barked harder, his body coiled tight with suspicion, but there was hesitation buried in the sound. Beneath the rage, a thread of confusion wove itself into the growls. His ears, usually pinned flat when a stranger approached, shifted slightly, flicking back and forth as if torn. His teeth remained bared, his voice thundered, but there was a pause now, the smallest fraction of doubt that even Frank noticed. The stranger tilted his head, just a fraction, his lips pressing into a line that was neither smile nor frown. His gaze was fixed, unwavering, but there was something behind it, a softness, a memory carried in silence. He held the wrapped object under his arm with care, as though it mattered far more than protecting himself. His hands remained visible, open enough to show he had no threat hidden in them, no weapon, no malice. It was a stance not of defense, but of patience, a posture that seemed deliberate. Frank shifted his weight, his cane pressing into the ground as he took another uncertain step forward. His eyes moved between the two of them, the dog he had raised and trusted, and the stranger who stood like a stone in the face of fury. It unnerved him, this lack of fear. He had seen hardened men flinch at less than what Max was displaying now. But this man didn't even blink when the dog's spit flew against the iron bars. His chest rose and fell with even breaths, his body steady, as though he had expected this encounter and prepared for it. The neighbors whispered from across the street. A woman gasped when Max lunged again, his snarl breaking into a furious bark that rattled the gate. Children pressed their faces against windows, wide-eyed at the confrontation. But the stranger did not give them what they expected. He didn't recoil, didn't shout for help, didn't even raise his arms in some instinctive shield. He simply looked at the animal with an expression that carried recognition, as if he knew something no one else did. Frank's mind flickered with unease. He could feel the strain in Max's body, the years of conditioning that told the dog to chase away every outsider. And yet, this wasn't the same rage Max showed the mailman or the delivery drivers. There was something layered in it, a push and pull that unsettled Frank. He could almost swear he saw Max hesitate, his growls breaking for half a heartbeat before roaring again, as if memory was clawing at instinct. The stranger finally spoke, not loudly, not sharply, but with a voice that cut through the noise with startling clarity. Max, the name was spoken simply, without command, without demand, just an acknowledgement. The effect was immediate, if subtle. Max froze for a split second, his head jerking back slightly, his eyes narrowing. The growl did not vanish, but it shifted, lower now, questioning. His body, still tense, shifted weight uneasily on his paws. The dog's gaze sharpened, searching the man's face, and for the first time, the wild fury in his barking began to sound uncertain. Frank's grip on his cane tightened. The name hung in the air, heavier than thunder. Only someone who had known Max long ago, before Frank had shut the gates on the world, would call him like that. The old veteran studied the stranger with new eyes, looking for signs, clues, any thread of truth in his calm posture and steady voice. The stranger didn't move closer. He didn't reach out, didn't tempt fate with sudden gestures. He only remained where he was, still and unflinching, as though understanding that this battle was not his to force. His calm was deliberate, born of knowledge that recognition could not be demanded. It had to be allowed. He let Max choose, standing quietly as though waiting for the storm to pass on its own. The night pressing around them, heavy with the dampness of the storm just past. Lightning flickered faintly on the horizon, but it was electricity between a man and the dog that held every eye. The stranger's calm was not the absence of fear. It was the presence of something deeper, a connection unspoken, a memory unshaken, and the patience to wait until the dog remembered too. Max's growl rumbled low in his throat, the kind of sound that seemed to vibrate through the iron gate itself. His teeth were still bared, but the force of his fury was no longer constant. It wavered in intensity, faltering at odd intervals, as if the rhythm of his anger was being disrupted by something he could not place. His ears, usually pressed flat against his skull when he was in full defense, twitched now, tilting one way, then the other. The tail that had been rigid and high with aggression stiffened, but no longer wagged in that sharp, threatening arc. Instead, it stilled, a sign of uncertainty that Frank caught immediately, though the neighbors watching from the shadows of their porches did not. The stranger's eyes had not moved from the dog. He remained still, breathing evenly, not raising his hands, not stepping forward. He seemed to know that the battle taking place was not between him and Max, but inside the animal itself. The storm of instinct, guard, protect, attack, was clashing against a buried recognition, a ghost of memory rising from the depths of years long gone. Frank narrowed his eyes, leaning heavier on his cane as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. He had seen Max like this only once before, years ago, when a soldier from his unit had visited unexpectedly and Max, still young, had recognized the scent of someone familiar before Frank had even spoken a word. That memory nagged at him now as he studied his dog's shifting posture. Max's chest still heaved with deep breaths, but the growl had changed. It no longer carried the sharp edge of absolute hostility. Instead, it had a wavering tone, uneven and hesitant. The dog's eyes flicked from the man's face to the object tucked beneath his arm, then back again. His ears twitched once more, forward, then back, as if he were listening for something that lived only in memory. The stranger seemed to sense this, lowering his head just slightly, his eyes never breaking away, his expression steady, but softer than before. It was not a look of dominance, not an attempt to claim control. It was the look of someone waiting to be recognized. Max shifted his stance, claws scraping against the dirt near the gate. He pressed forward once, then stopped abruptly, his nose flaring, drawing the air with short, quick sniffs. His bark never came, replaced by the sound of breath through nostrils that caught a scent he knew but could not yet place. His body trembled with tension, torn between what had been taught and what he suddenly felt tugging at him from some half-forgotten corner of his past. Frank's mouth tightened as he watched. He had trained Max to trust no one but him, to grow into the fierce guardian the dog had become. Yet now, for the first time in years, Max was hesitating in the presence of another. The veteran's eyes narrowed on the stranger, suspicion colliding with curiosity. He wondered what kind of man could stand calm beneath the weight of such fury, and more importantly, what kind of bond could leave such an imprint on a dog so conditioned to distrust. The neighbors noticed it too, though they lacked the understanding Frank carried. From across the street, they whispered to one another, noting how the dog's tone had softened, how the snarl seemed almost confused. Children peered wide-eyed through curtains, pointing at the way Max's ears were no longer pinned but upright, swiveling slightly as if straining to recall familiar sound. Max took another step back from the gate. It wasn't retreat, but reconsideration. His head tilted, his jaw still tense, saliva dripping from his bare teeth, yet his eyes no longer carried the unbroken glare of hostility. They searched, scanning the man's features with intensity, pausing at the line of his jaw, the way he stood, even the cadence of his breathing. Something inside the dog stirred, a flicker of familiarity, breaking through the layers of training and suspicion. The stranger remained motionless, his lips parting as though he might speak again, but he refrained, choosing silence as his ally. Silence, after all, was what allowed the dog to listen to himself. His chest rose slowly, his hands loose at his sides, Not inviting, not threatening, just present. Frank's knuckles tightened around a cane, and though he said nothing, his breath caught when Max did something unexpected. The growl that had been rising and falling finally broke off mid-sound, replaced by a low whine, faint but distinct. It was a sound of doubt, the sound of recognition almost within reach but not yet named. His ears shifted forward again, body tense but no longer rigid in anger. His tail, stiff as a rod only moments ago, gave the smallest twitch at the tip, betraying a threat of conflict deep within him. The air seemed to hold still around them. Neighbors frozen, Frank uneasy, the stranger calm. Max stood before the gate with the weight of years in his memory, torn between the loyalty of his training and the spark of something older, deeper, and infinitely more familiar. Something had begun to awaken, and the question hanging in the silence was whether he would remember in time. The stranger's calm remained unbroken. Even as Max stood stiff at the gate, Growl caught somewhere between defiance and confusion. The air was heavy, the sky still dark with remnants of the storm, and the silence around them felt unnatural, as though even the neighborhood itself waited to see what would unfold. Frank shifted uneasily, his hand tightening on the cane, his voice caught in his throat. He wanted to demand that the man leave, to stop staring at his dog like he was conjuring some hidden spell, but something inside him, some old instinct sharpened by years in the service, held him back. He sensed the moment was fragile, like stepping onto ice that could shatter with the wrong move. Then, the stranger's lips parted, and for the first time since he appeared, he spoke. His voice was low, soft in the growl that still trembled in Max's chest, and yet it carried with it a certainty that cut through the night. "Max!" he said, not loud, not commanding, just clear. The name rolled out like a memory instead of a call. Max's ears flicked sharply, his head jerking just slightly at the sound. His growl faltered, the rhythm broken, as though the simple recognition of his own name spoken in that tone stirred something buried deep. But then came the moment that silenced even Frank. The man leaned closer, his eyes never leaving Max's, and whispered another name. It wasn't the dog's, it was the name of a place, or perhaps a person, something from years long gone. "Shadow," he murmured. The word lingered like smoke, a word that carried weight no stranger could know. Frank's heart clenched at the sound. He hadn't heard that name in over a decade, and yet it rang through the night, like a bell tolling from another life. Shadow had been Max's first call sign, the name Frank used when training him as a pup for the kind of obedience that demanded silence and trust. It wasn't a name the neighbors knew. It wasn't a name the inspectors or mailmen ever heard. It was a name spoken only in private moments between soldier and dog, a bond sealed in those quiet hours when no one else was around. And now, here was this man, a stranger, whispering it as if he had every right to. Max froze. His body, once rigid with distrust, quivered with uncertainty. His ears pressed forward. His growl died on his tongue, and his head tilted slowly as though the sound that word was pulling at a string knotted deep inside him. His tail twitched once, stiff and unsure, but no longer lifted in aggression. His eyes, hard and unblinking only moments before, softened with a glimmer of recognition. He sniffed the air again, shorter this time, more focused, as if the voice itself carried a scent he could not mistake. The neighbors who had gathered to watch leaned closer, whispering among themselves, though they could not hear the second name. To them, the scene was only stranger now. A dog that had terrified the neighborhood for years suddenly silenced, not by threats or force, but by the quiet voice of a man they had never seen before. Children clutched their parents' arms, sensing a shift they could not explain, while the adults exchanged glances filled with both unease and curiosity. Frank's lips parted as though to speak, but no words came. He stared at the man, studying him, searching for the answer in the lines of his face. How could he know that name? How could he reach across years of silence and stir something so deep within his dog with a single word? The veteran's chest tightened as old memories surfaced. Long nights, field drills, voices calling out across training grounds. Somewhere in that haze, there was a younger man with the same steady gaze, the same way of standing without fear in the face of growling teeth. Max whimpered. The sound was small, almost lost beneath the quiet of the street, but Frank heard it as clearly as a gunshot. His dog, the one who growled at every soul that dared step near the fence, had given voice not to fury but to longing. He pressed against the gate now, not lunging, not attacking, but straining forward with his nose, ears twitching at the echo of the word still hanging in the air. The stranger said it again, barely more than a whisper. "Shadow." This time, Max's tail moved. Not much, just the faintest wag, uncertain and restrained, but it was enough. It was the first crack in the wall Frank had built between his dog and the rest of the world, the first sign that the past had not been forgotten. Frank's hand shook against his cane as he finally found his voice. His words came slowly, halting, the disbelief heavy in his tone. Who are you?" he asked, though a part of him already feared the answer. The man didn't look at Frank. His eyes remained locked on Max. Steady, calm, waiting for the moment recognition bloomed fully. "An old friend," he said quietly, as if the words were meant for both dog and master. And in that instant, Frank understood that the stranger was not just anyone who had stumbled onto his gate. He was someone tied to the fabric of his past, someone who knew the bond between soldier and dog, someone who carried with him a memory of the name that had been buried but not erased. Max remembered too. It showed in the softening of his eyes, in the quiet whine that escaped his throat, in the way he pressed closer to the gate as though longing to close the distance between now and then. The past had spoken, and nothing would be the same. The night seemed to pause with Max. His body, once a coiled spring of fury, went rigid at the gate. The growl that had rumbled from deep in his chest dissolved into a low, uncertain hum that trembled more from memory than menace. His eyes, wide and unblinking, fixed on the stranger as though caught between two worlds, one of suspicion and hostility, the other of faint recognition pressing up from some long-buried place. The silence that followed was heavier than all the barking that had come before, thick enough that even the onlookers dared not whisper. The storm's distant thunder rolled like an afterthought, while the sharp smell of rain still clung to the air, but none of it could pull focus in the stillness at the gate. Frank felt the hairs on his arms rise, his grip on the cane tightening until his knuckles whitened. He knew Max as he knew himself. He knew every sound of his bark, every flick of his ears, every shift in his stance. But this was something new, something he hadn't seen since Max was a pup and first learning to separate commands from instinct. It was hesitation, not weakness, not submission, but pure, raw confusion. The dog stood tall and tense, every muscle engaged, yet the certainty of attack had left him. He didn't advance, didn't retreat. He froze, locked between two impulses. The stranger did not move either. He stood still, his eyes holding Max's, as though he understood the weight of this moment and refused to break it. His calm seemed unshakable, even as the silence stretched long enough to make those watching shift uncomfortably. It was not the silence of peace, nor the silence of fear. It was a silence of recognition struggling to surface, as if the past itself had laid a hand across the scene and demanded pause. The neighbors, drawn by curiosity, watched with widened eyes from the edges of the street. A woman clutched her son's shoulder, whispering for him not to make a sound. A man adjusted his cap nervously, shaking his head at what he thought was madness. For years, Max had been the terror of the neighborhood, his growl a warning everyone obeyed without question. Now, that same dog stood motionless, staring into the face of a man he should have torn apart, and none of them could make sense of it. Max's ears twitched forward, then back again. His nostrils flared, pulling in the scent of the man as though it carried secrets words could not reveal. His tail hung stiffly, no longer raised in dominance, but not yet lowered in surrender. Every part of him trembled, not with rage, but with the strain of memory. A sound escaped him, a low whine that seemed almost unintentional, slipping out before he could suppress it. The noise startled Frank more than any bark ever had. Frank's breath caught in his chest. He had heard Max bark at shadows, snarl at footsteps, roar at thunder, but a whine, soft, uncertain, almost pleading, that was something he thought his dog had left behind long ago. He looked from Max to the stranger, his eyes narrowing as questions clawed at his mind. There was no explanation that made sense. Unless, somehow, this man was not a stranger after all. The air pressed heavier still, the kind of weight that made time feel stretched. Even the crickets had fallen silent. their song drowned out by the tension of the moment. Frank took a step forward, his cane clicking against the wet stone path. Max's head turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge his master's presence, but his gaze snapped back to the man as though magnetized. It was as if he needed Frank to see it too, that something in this man was not foreign, that something buried deep demanded he pause. The stranger remained still, his breathing steady, his posture open. He seemed to know that any sudden movement would shatter the fragile balance and return Max to fury. He let the stillness grow, allowed the dog's confusion to ripple outward like circles across water. His eyes, calm and unwavering, held not dominance but familiarity, the kind that came from shared history rather than control. Frank's voice wavered when he finally spoke, barely more than a whisper. "Max!" The name felt small in the charged air. Max flicked an ear toward him, but the spell was not broken. The pause deepened, pulling Frank into its gravity. It was no ordinary stillness. It was the kind that followed the first crack of memory, the kind that hung between recognition and denial. In Max's eyes, Frank saw it plainly, the struggle to reconcile the beast that guarded his gate with the pup who once trusted more than one man. He saw the fight between the loyalty he had hardened into exclusivity and the bond that had been shared with another long ago. And so, the night stood still, wrapped in that fragile balance. A dog frozen at the edge of revelation, a stranger steady in his calm, a master holding his breath against what might come next. It was a stillness before change, before recognition bloomed into something undeniable. A silence so heavy it felt alive, pressing against every chest on the street, whispering that the world was about to shift. The moment stretched long enough to make the world itself seem hesitant to move. Rain still dripped from the leaves overhead, sliding down in lazy rivulets, but even the storm seemed to have softened into a waiting silence. Max stood rigid at the gate, every muscle tight beneath his bristling coat. His eyes were fixed on the man, unblinking, while Frank watched from a few steps behind, unable to decide whether to call his dog back or let whatever was happening unfold. Then came the smallest shift, one that would have gone unnoticed by anyone who hadn't spent years studying the dog's every movement. Max's weight shifted from his back legs to his front, his paws pressing just an inch closer to the bars of the gate. The growl, once steady and harsh, broke apart like a crumbling wall. It slipped down into his chest, reshaping itself into something softer, uncertain, almost mournful. A low whine followed, trembling at the edges, a sound no one in the neighborhood had ever heard from him. The effect was immediate. Gasps rose from the onlookers who had gathered quietly at the edge of the street. Mothers who had clutched their children closer, loosened their grip, though their eyes stayed wide. A man muttered under his breath that the beast must be tricking them, but Evie felt quiet again when the dog whined a second time, softer still. The ferocity that had once marked Max as untouchable was fading, replaced by a hesitation that carried with it the weight of recognition. Frank's throat felt dry as he tried to swallow. For years he had insisted that Max was misunderstood, that beneath the growl there was loyalty, not danger. Yet he had never imagined seeing that loyalty falter in this way, as though his dog's world was being split open by something stronger than instinct. His hand trembled against the knob of his cane, torn between calling Max back into control and waiting to see if this fragile moment would reveal the truth behind the stranger's calm. Max's ears pricked forward, straining toward the voice that had spoken his name moments before. His body lowered slightly, no longer held in a rigid stance of defense, but not yet released into ease. The ground beneath his paws was damp, the scent of earth and rain heavy in the air. His nose twitched, pulling in the smell of the man to the iron bars, as if it carried answers words could not. A memory was forming, intangible but powerful, urging him forward against all the lessons Frank had drilled into him since he was a pup. The stranger did not move, not an inch. His arms remained loose at his sides, his face calm, his eyes never leaving the dog. He seemed to understand that the smallest motion would break the spell, that Max's step forward was not an invitation for closeness, but a fragile test of memory. He stood like stone, letting the dog choose. The seconds ticked by, stretched taut. Then Max's paw lifted from the muddy ground, hesitated in the air, and pressed forward again. The scrape of claw against wet earth was faint, but it sounded loud in the silence. His body followed, one careful step, closing the gap by inches. Another whine escaped him, longer this time, carried with the ache of recognition just out of reach. Frank's heart thudded painfully in his chest. He had seen Max leap at the gate with violence that made full-grown men retreat in fear, but he had never seen him approach it like this. Cautious, searching, vulnerable. He wanted to call out, to demand answers from the stranger whose presence had unraveled his dog's certainty, but he found himself unable to break the stillness. Some instinct told him that this was not his moment to interrupt. The neighbors stood frozen, as though watching something sacred. Even those who had demanded the dog's removal felt their anger soften into bewilderment. A beast who had embodied fear was moving closer to a man no one knew, not with bared teeth but with hesitant trust. The air seemed to bend around it, carrying the unspoken truth that they were witnessing something rare, something deeply human, though it belonged to a dog. Max stopped just short of the bars, his nose brushing the cold iron, his breath fogging the damp air between him and the man. His body trembled, not with rage, but with a confusion that ran deeper than instinct. The growl was gone now, buried beneath the weight of memory and the pull of familiarity. His tail flicked once, uncertain, before stiffening again. The man lowered his head slightly, still not moving his feet, his eyes softening with the smallest trace of a smile. He whispered the name again gently, as if offering it like a gift rather than command. Max's ears tilted toward him, his breath catching in a soft, unsteady pant. His body shifted once more, leaning just slightly closer to the gate. And in that fragile moment, the dog's world seemed to tilt. He was no longer the untouchable beast at the gate, nor the obedient guardian shaped by years of Frank's training. He was something else, a creature standing at the edge of memory, reaching toward a past he had almost forgotten. The neighborhood held its breath. Frank gripped his cane as though it might anchor him, and the rain fell in soft rhythms around them. The first step forward had been taken, and nothing would be the same again. The man's movements were deliberate, measured, as though he understood how easily the moment could shatter. Slowly, with the kind of patience born of familiarity, he bent one knee to the damp ground just outside the gate. The old hinges rattled faintly as Max shifted his weight, claws scraping against stone. The stranger didn't flinch at the sound, didn't glance at Frank or the neighbors standing in tense silence across the street. His focus remained on the dog, and with quiet certainty, he extended one hand to the bars of the gate, palm open, fingers loose, offering nothing more than space for recognition. Max froze. His chest heaved, breath coming quick but shallow, steam curling into chill air with each exhale. His eyes flicked from a man's still face to the outstretched hand, then back again. Suspicion and something softer warring inside him. His ears shifted, first pinned back with caution, then twitching forward as if memory was calling. His body lowered just slightly, shoulders hunching, every muscle taut with indecision. Frank tightened his grip on his cane, unease rising in him like a tide. This was not the Max he knew, the iron-willed guardian who had never yielded an inch of ground to a stranger. To see him hesitate, to see him waver in silence, unsettled Frank more than any display of rage ever had. He wanted to call his dog back, to end the strangeness unraveling in front of him, but his voice caught in his throat. He, too, was waiting, searching for meaning in the dog's hesitation. The hand remained steady. Rainwater dripped from the man's sleeve, rolling down his wrist, but he didn't move to wipe it away. His fingers stayed open, a gesture of trust in its simplest form. For long moments, Max only stared, nose twitching, head tilting slightly as the pull of scent and memory drew him closer. Then, with a soft whine that cracked the tension in the air, Max leaned in. He pressed his muzzle forward, nostrils flaring, taking the scent that had hung faint but undeniable in the air. His nose brushed the man's skin, damp and trembling, as if the truth of years could be pulled from the faint traces of sweat, rain, and something deeper, the scent of a bond once known. His tail quivered, stiff at first, then loosening with the faintest tremor. The growl that had once ruled his throat was gone, replaced by sharp, searching breaths, each one tugging at the fragile thread of recognition buried within him. The neighbors who had lingered near the sidewalk leaned forward, some covering their mouths, others whispering under their breath. They had seen Max strike fear into grown men, but none had seen him this close to vulnerable. A child clutching his mother's hand asked in a hushed tone why the scary dog was crying, and the mother, unable to answer, only shook her head. Frank stepped closer to the gate, his weather boots sinking into the softened ground. His chest tightened with conflicting emotions. Fear, suspicion, but also a deep ache as he saw the way Max trembled at the hand before him. It was a posture of searching, not aggression. He realized with sudden clarity that Max was fighting against himself, against years of conditioning that told him to mistrust, against the loneliness that shaped him, and against a longing for something he could not yet name. Max sniffed again, deeper this time, pressing his wet nose firmly into the stranger's palm. His chest rose sharply, as if forgotten truth had rushed back into him all at once. His body wavered, ears dropping back not in fear, but in surrender. The low whine grew louder, breaking into sound of something long buried, a recognition that came not through sight or sound, but through scent, the most primal of bonds. The man's eyes softened. He did not speak, not yet, knowing words would only clutter the fragile silence. Instead, he let Max search him, let him rediscover a piece of the past through the closeness of breath and skin. For Max, each inhalation brought not just scent, but memory. The faint trace of leather once gripped during training, the familiar mix of tobacco and soap, the lingering undertone of someone who had been there when he was small, fragile, and unformed. A quiet sound escaped Max's throat, half whine, half sigh. He pressed closer, his body leaning against the gate as if proximity alone could pull certainty from the air. His tail moved again, slow and uncertain, but moving nonetheless, a crack in the wall he had built against the world. The hand he sniffed remained still, warm against his muzzle despite the rain. Frank's breath caught. His dog, the animal who had let no stranger close, who had driven back neighbors and inspectors alike, was leaning into this man as though the years of suspicion meant nothing. It was as if the storm, the warnings, the complaints, all of it had led to the strange, impossible recognition. For the first time in years, Max's defenses had fallen, not with force, but with memory rekindled by scent. The silence deepened. No one moved. The old dog breathed in over and over until his body no longer trembled with confusion, but with the weight of what he knew to be true. He had found certainty, and with it, a piece of himself long thought lost. The growls were gone, and in their place was a sound softer than any had ever expected. A gentle, fragile trust offered to the hand he remembered. The transformation happened in a breath. One moment Max was pressed against the gate, nostrils flaring, body taut with the tension of memory fighting instinct. The next, something within him broke open, a flood of recognition that surged through every muscle. His eyes widened, ears dropping back as his tail gave a sudden, violent thump against the wooden post. Then another, and another. The sound grew frantic, uncontrolled, as his tail wagged with force that shook his whole body. With a sudden lunge, he reared up on his hind legs and slammed against the gate, not with a rage that so often shaken its iron bars, but with an energy that startled all who watched. The neighbors who had gathered gasped, some stepping back, convinced an attack was about to unfold. Mothers pulled children closer, and a delivery man who had lingered at the edge of the street instinctively shielded himself behind his bag. But then they saw it. The posture was different. The growl was gone. In its place came the unmistakable rhythm of joy, sharp, rapid breaths, a whine mixed with a bark, and the wild thudding of a tail against the gate. The sound carried across the damp street, confusing those who had only known the dog as a beast of menace. Frank's eyes widened in disbelief. He had seen his companion show loyalty, vigilance, even affection, but never like this. Max's body writhed with excitement, pressing forward again and again, paws scraping at the bars as if trying to climb through them. The deep-set lines of Frank's face trembled as he gripped his cane tighter, torn between fear and awe. This was not a guard dog's reaction. It was the raw, unfiltered joy of reunion. The stranger did not move quickly, did not rush to seize a moment. He remained steady, hands still extended, though now his lips parted in a smile so faint it seemed carved from memory itself. He let Max's joy bloom unchecked, waiting for the storm of recognition to run its natural course. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, Gentle words meant not for the crowd, but for the dog who had once known him. The air seemed to vibrate with Max's excitement. His nails screeched across metal as he jumped again, higher this time, straining his body upward as if height alone could close the years between them. His eyes glistened with a wetness that wasn't just the rain. Each whine cracked, rising higher in pitch, pushing against the silence that had once defined his watch. No one watching had ever seen him like this. The neighbors who had called for his removal now stood in stunned quiet, unable to reconcile the beast of their complaints with the creature who now looked so much like a pup reunited with a long-lost friend. Frank felt his throat tighten. Memories of training, of discipline, of the lonely evenings spent with Max pressed at his mind. He had thought the dog was his alone, molded by his hand, bound by their bond. But here, in the frantic joy spilling out at the gate, he realized Max had carried something older, something buried deep that even he had never touched. This man, this quiet stranger, had unlocked it without effort, and Frank did not know whether to feel betrayed or moved. Max leapt again, body slamming against the gate with force that rattled its hinges. This time his bark rang out, not in warning, but in a sharp, joyful cry. It startled a group of children who had dared peek from behind their mother's coat, and yet when they looked closer, they saw a dog transformed. His tail wagged so fiercely, it seemed it might never stop. His body twisted with happiness, straining against the barrier that kept him from a man he now remembered. The stranger lowered his hand briefly, then raised it again, palm outward as if to say he understood, as if to calm the dog without words. But Max would not calm. He paced, jumped, circled, and returned to bars, over and over, driven by something greater than command. His joy spilled into the night air, cutting through the storm's remnants like sunlight after rain. Somewhere in the crowd, a neighbor whispered that maybe they had been wrong, that maybe the dog wasn't just anger and teeth. Another nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the gate where a story they did not understand was unfolding. For years they had seen only the surface, a snarling guard dog, a threat that loomed behind iron and wood. Now they were witnessing what lay beneath, and it unsettled them more than fear ever had. Frank stepped closer to the gate, his cane sinking into the mud, his voice finally breaking free. "Max," he whispered, not as a command, but as a plea, as if he needed reassurance that the bond he knew was still there. Max turned his head for a fraction of a second, meeting Frank's eyes, tail still whipping wildly, and in that glance was something both reassuring and devastating. He had not forgotten Frank, but he had remembered someone else. The stranger finally spoke again, softly, warmly, calling the dog by name. Max whined louder, pawing the gate until his pads were raw. His body moved with a desperation born not of anger, but of longing. He had returned, not to the past he lived every day, but to the one he thought lost forever. And in that moment, with the neighborhood watching, the storm still dripping from rooftops, the old guard dog shed his fearsome skin. What leapt against the gate was not a beast, not a threat, but a soul rediscovering joy. Frank stood frozen at the edge of the porch, the glow from the storm lantern still flickering behind him, casting a pale light across his deeply lined face. His cane dug into the damp soil, the pressure so firm his knuckles whitened. For years he had lived with the certainty that Max was his, that every command, every look, every instinct of the dog was tied only to him. Yet now, in the space of a breath, that certainty crumbled. He stared at the animal he had raised from a trembling pup, and what stared back was not obedience, nor even loyalty in the way he knew it. It was joy, wild, unrestrained joy, directed not at him but at a stranger who had stepped out of the storm. The sight shook him more than any warning from neighbors or inspector had ever done. Max had never softened for anyone else, never let down the growl that protected them both from a world Frank kept at bay. Now, the dog pressed against the gate, tail whipping the air like a flag of surrender, his body twisting with happiness as though trying to push through the bars. Frank's chest ached at the sound. Whines where growls used to be, sharp cries that belonged to a much younger creature than the weathered guardian standing in front of him. Frank's lips parted, but no words came at first. His breath fogged faintly in the cold night air, mingling with the damp mist rising off the earth after rain. He tried again, voice rasped with age and disbelief. Who are you?" His tone was neither welcoming nor hostile. It was a demand wrenched from a man whose reality was unraveling in front of a gathering of neighbors who stood in hushed silence, watching everything. The stranger did not immediately respond. He kept his gaze fixed on Max, hands still extended, though now the lines of his mouth tightened into something between patience and sorrow. Frank's voice grew louder, more insistent, the rough edge of command sharpening every syllable. "Answer me. Who are you, and how in God's name does my dog know you?" The words cracked in the night air, echoing against the fence posts and dripping eaves. Max paused for the briefest instant, torn between the old master's tone and the pull of memory awakened by the newcomer. His ears flicked back toward Frank, then forward again toward the man. The conflict in his posture stung Frank deeply, as though years of certainty had been pulled away like a rug underfoot. The neighbors, uneasy witnesses, edged closer. Some leaned into one another's shoulders, whispering theories that rose and fell in hushed tones. The delivery man who had been hiding behind his bag now stood within his feet, eyes wide as he studied the scene like a play he could not leave. Mothers clutched children closer, though not in fear this time. It was curiosity that held them. Curiosity about the man who could draw such a transformation from the beast that had ruled the street with growls and teeth. Frank took a step closer, his boots sinking into the softened ground, his cane dragging in the mud. His face was shadowed, but his eyes gleamed with suspicion, hurt, and a trembling need for answers. He pointed the end of the cane toward the stranger, his voice rising again. "I've kept this dog at my side longer than I've had most people in my life. He doesn't bow to anyone, doesn't wag for anyone. So tell me, what have you done? What do you know?" His breath came harder now, his shoulders stiff with a mixture of fear and anger. The vulnerability in his tone was almost hidden, but not enough. For beneath the bark of his words lay the faint quiver of a man afraid of losing the only constant he had left. To see Max in this state was like seeing his own reflection betray him. The stranger finally lowered his hand, drawing it back toward his chest. His eyes, calm and steady, turned fully toward Frank. There was no malice there, no arrogance, only the heaviness of someone carrying a history too long unsaid. Yet still he did not answer, not immediately. He let Frank's questions linger in the damp air, let the old man's voice hang with all the weight of years. Max whined again, pressing harder at the gate, ears back in a posture that looked almost pleading. His tail had not slowed. His eyes moved between the man and Frank, torn but unable to contain the joy that had already broken free. The tension held for what felt like minutes, though it was only seconds. Frank's voice lowered now, softer, almost hoarse. The anger bled out, replaced by a deep bewilderment. "Tell me," he said, "how does my fierce dog know you like this?" The storm had passed, but the silence that followed carried its own weight. Every neighbor held their breath, the night waiting for the answer that would either mend or shatter the fragile order that had ruled this house on the hill. And in the midst of it all, Frank's stunned face remained fixed on the man, searching desperately for a truth he was not sure he wanted to hear. The man at the gate stood very still, the weight of Frank's demand pressing on him as much as the curious stares of the neighbors beyond. His hand, once extended to Max, lowered slowly to his side, though his eyes never strayed from the dog whose wagging tail still whipped the night air into a rhythm of recognition. There was something fragile about the moment, a thin thread that could snap if the wrong word was spoken. At last, the man exhaled, and the sound carried the gravity of years. "My name is Daniel," he said, his voice steady but low, almost as if he were confessing rather than introducing himself. The name hung in the damp air like a bell tolling after a funeral, familiar yet distant, striking chords Frank hadn't let himself hear in years. The old man stiffened, the grip on his cane tightening, as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. His jaw worked silently, the syllables replaying in his head, demanding recognition he wanted to refuse. Daniel, a name he hadn't spoken in so long that it felt strange on his tongue. His son, his estranged son, standing at his gate in the middle of the night, with the storm still dripping off the eaves, and Max, his fiercely loyal, unyielding dog, pressing against the bars in joy like a child seeing a long-lost brother. Frank's breath hitched. His voice, when it came, was rough and strained, filled with years of silence. "No," he muttered, though it sounded less like denial and more like disbelief. "No, you can't." He stopped, shaking his head as though the motion could push away what his eyes saw clearly. But Daniel did not retreat. He took one careful step closer, not toward Frank, but toward Max, and he crouched so that his eyes were level with the dog's. His hand hovered near the gate again, steady but patient. "I helped raise him," Daniel said softly. His words meant as much for Frank as for the animal straining to reach him. "When he was small enough to fit in my arms, when his ears were too big for his head, I was the one who fed him, walked him, played with him in the yard. Don't you remember? Don't you think he would?" The memories stirred without permission. Frank tried to push them back, but images flooded his mind. Of a boy in his early 20s crouched in the same yard, laughing while a clumsy puppy tumbled after him. Of muddy shoes on the back step. Of late evenings where Daniel's voice could be heard coaxing the pup to sit or stay, always with more patience than Frank had ever given. He remembered how Max's small body had once curled up beside Daniel on the porch, the two of them dozing in the twilight, as though they were littermates. And then, just as quickly, Frank remembered the shouting, the slammed door, the final fight that had ripped years of silence between them, a silence so complete that it had hardened into a way of life. He had never expected to see Daniel again. Now the silence cracked, and it was Max who bridged it. The dog whined louder, pawing at the ground, pressing his snout between the bars to reach the hand that waited. Daniel smiled faintly, his eyes glistening with something he did not try to hide. "He hasn't forgotten," he said, his voice breaking just enough to betray the years of distance. Frank stood rigid, his heart pounding unevenly in his chest. He wanted to speak, to demand answers, to lash out with the anger that had kept him company for so long. Yet what rose instead was not fury, but something more complicated, something softer, buried under layers of pride and regret. He felt as though he were staring at a ghost, a younger version of himself etched into the man standing in the rain-soaked yard. "You," Frank whispered finally, barely louder than the sigh of wind to the wet grass. "You came back." The words tasted bitter and sweet all at once, as if he couldn't decide whether to spit them out or hold them close. Daniel straightened now, lifting his gaze to meet Frank's across the gate. His expression was neither defensive nor triumphant. It was weary, open, marked by years that had carved deeper lines into his face, but had not erased the familiarity in his eyes. "I didn't come for me," he said quietly. "I came because of him." He nodded toward Max, who barked once, not sharply, but in an eager, almost celebratory way that shattered the last of Frank's disbelief. The neighbors shifted, murmurs rippling through the small crowd, but Frank hardly heard them. His eyes were locked on Daniel, his mind caught between memory and the present, between the past that had broken them and the possibility, still fragile, that this return meant something more. Max, pressed against the gate, wagged as though the years between them had been nothing but days, as though time could be erased by recognition, by love that had never truly gone. Frank's stunned face softened, though the tension in his body remained. He opened his mouth again, but the words faltered before they could take shape. He was a man torn between the fortress he had built around his life and the sudden crack that threatened to let light inside. And standing at the gate, with Max as the bridge between them, Daniel waited, his name echoing in Frank's mind like a forgotten melody suddenly remembered. Frank stood as though rooted to the ground, his weight leaning heavily on the cane that seemed less steady than usual. The neighbors had begun to drift away, their curiosity sated by the dramatic turn of events, but few lingered across the street, unwilling to abandon a story that had grown beyond rumor. The night was thick with the scent of wet earth after the storm, and only the rhythmic panting of Max broke the silence. The dog had pressed himself firmly against the gate, tail thrashing in uncontrollable joy, his eyes never leaving Daniel. Daniel did not move hastily. He looked at Frank the way a man looks at someone whose approval once meant everything. His shoulders rose with a deep breath, and then he began to speak, his words quiet but carrying the weight of years long unspoken. "I should have come sooner," he admitted, his voice not defensive but stripped of the armor he might have worn. "But I thought maybe you wouldn't want me back. Maybe the door was closed for good." Frank's lips parted, but no sound came. His eyes narrowed, studying the man who had once been a boy in his household, a boy who had left with fire in his eyes and bitterness sharp enough to wound. I left because I thought I knew better, Daniel continued, his gaze drifting briefly to Max before returning to his father. We argued about everything, work, the future, how I was wasting my time. I couldn't breathe under the weight of your expectations. And so I left. I thought I'd find freedom, make something of myself on my own terms. He gave a humorless laugh, one that cracked in the middle. Turns out the world isn't so kind to stubborn young men without a plan. Max whined at the shift in tone, pawing at the earth as if urging him on. I worked odd jobs, took up shifts in cities you'd never care to see. I thought I'd prove you wrong, show up one day successful, with everything you said I couldn't achieve. But life doesn't bend that easily. There were years when I had nothing but the clothes on my back. And in those years, I kept thinking about home, even when I swore I wouldn't. I remembered the porch, the smell of supper to the window, the sound of your boots in the hallway. His eyes softened then, wet at the edges. And him, always him. He motioned toward Max, who pressed his nose harder through the gate, desperate to bridge the distance. You probably don't remember how much time I spent with him when you first brought him home, Daniel said. You trained him hard, firm. But when you went to work or were too tired, I kept going. I'd take him out back, run him until his legs could barely carry him. I taught him the small things, the ones you might not have noticed. Waiting for a whistle, fetching without tearing the toy apart. I even let him sleep in my room, sometimes when the storm scared him. He was mine as much as yours, and maybe that's why he still remembers me. Frank shifted, his face unreadable in the dim light. His hands gripped the cane tighter, his knuckles pale. I never forgot him, Daniel said, his voice dipping lower. In the worst places I ended up, when I was alone, I thought about that dog, about the way he trusted me, no matter what. And I thought about you, even when I hated myself for it. I told myself I'd come back when I was worthy, when I had something to offer, when I could stand in front of you without shame. But the years slipped by, and shame grew heavier the longer I stayed away. Max barked then, a sharp sound that cut through confession like punctuation. Daniel smiled faintly at the dog before turning back to his father. I didn't come back to settle scores. I didn't come for pity. I came because something in me said it was time. Maybe it was the thought of him growing old, of you growing older. I couldn't let the years finish me off without trying. Frank's face remained carved from stone, but in his eyes there was a flicker, anger, grief, perhaps even recognition. The old man's silence was thick, but Daniel did not falter. He stood steady, his story laid bare, offering nothing but truth and the hope that it might bridge the years. Max knew me before I knew myself, Daniel said finally, and seeing him remember, it means the past isn't gone. Maybe there's still a way back, even if it's not the way it once was. The gate stood between them, a physical barrier mirroring the years of silence. Yet Max, pressing close, wagging furiously, seemed to deny its power. His joy was uncontained, as though to him nothing had ever been broken. For the first time in years, Frank felt his anger soften under the weight of memory. He could almost hear the sound of Daniel's younger laughter drifting from the yard, the bark of a puppy tumbling over its own paws, the life that might have been if pride hadn't pushed them apart. Frank's lips parted as though words might finally come, but he held them back. For now he listened. Daniel's voice, cracked with honesty, filled the night, and Max's joyful presence made it clear that the story was not finished yet. Frank's breath came heavier than he would have liked, a slow, uneven rhythm that betrayed the storm inside him more than he wanted Daniel to see. He gripped his cane as though it were a lifeline, though his hand trembled faintly on the handle. For years he had practiced the art of silence, the armor of a man who had seen enough loss to decide that burying it was easier than living it. His life had become a pattern, discipline, routine, and control. And then, without warning, the man standing before him, the boy who had once called him father, had cut straight through it, peeling back layers Frank had long convinced himself were permanent. The anger rose first, sharp and bitter. Frank's eyes narrowed as memories pressed against him. Arguments slammed like doors, words hurled like stones, nights spent alone in a house that felt emptier than war barracks. He remembered the sting of betrayal when Daniel left, The silence that followed, the gnawing suspicion that he had failed both as a father and as a man. Anger was a safer emotion, the shield he knew how to wield. His voice, when it finally emerged, carried the rough edge of that shield. "You had years," he said, each word heavy. "Years to come back, to write, to say something. And you didn't." Daniel stood still, the dog's joy rattling the gate between them. But he did not try to interrupt. He let Frank's words fall, let them carry the weight they needed. "You left me to bury everything," Frank continued, his chest tightening as though the words themselves were hard to breathe. "I kept this house together alone. I kept him alive, trained, safe, and all the while you were out there. What? Living? Forgetting?" His voice cracked on the last word, not with rage, but with something closer to grief. He clenched his jaw hard, but the crack had already revealed what lay beneath. Relief, unexpected and unwelcome, rose at the same time. Seeing Daniel again, older, worn down by life, but alive, struck Frank in a way he hadn't prepared for. He had imagined Daniel dead more times than he cared to admit. Lost in some nameless city alley, buried without a grave marker, a casualty of stubbornness. To see him here, standing upright, speaking with a voice that carried both regret and determination, unraveled the certainty Frank had built around his absence. The sight forced him to acknowledge a truth he had never let himself consider. He had missed his son more than he had hated him. The contradiction pulled him apart. His shoulders stiffened under the weight of years of bitterness. Yet a tremor of something softer shook through him. Max, pressing against the gate, wagged his tail wildly, oblivious to the history that hung between the men. To the dog, there was no anger, no betrayal. Only reunion, only the return of someone loved. That pure joy pierced through Frank's defenses like nothing else could. He looked at Daniel again, really looked. The lines on his son's face told stories Frank didn't know. Hard roads, lean years, mistakes survived. And though his first instinct was to demand answers, to hold him accountable for every wound, another instinct whispered from deep inside, quieter but undeniable. That whisper told him this might be the last chance. Old men didn't get many more opportunities to rebuild what had been lost. Frank's lips tightened, and he turned his gaze toward the porch as though searching for strength in the shadows of his own home. He had once thought discipline could carry him through anything. Discipline to raise a son, to train a dog, to endure war and its aftermath. But discipline had not saved him from loneliness, and it would not carry him through this moment. His cane tapped the ground once, steadying him as his chest rose and fell unevenly. His eyes burned, not from the cold air, not from the storm that had passed, but from something he had denied himself for too long. His voice, when it returned, had lost some of its sharpness. "You broke something when you left," he said quietly, "and I built walls so I wouldn't feel every day. But seeing you here, with him remembering you like no time has passed," his throat caught, and he had to stop, swallowing hard. "Damn it, Daniel, you've tore it all down." Daniel's face shifted, guilt and relief colliding in his expression. He took a step closer, though still outside the gate, not daring to push too far. "Maybe it's time those walls came down," he said softly. "For both of us." Frank turned back toward Max, who pressed his nose harder against the iron, whining in impatience, as if begging his master to see what he already knew. Frank's hand tightened on the cane one last time, then slowly loosened. The anger didn't vanish. It simmered, old and raw, but alongside it now was the undeniable pull of relief, of longing, of the smallest flicker of hope. For the first time in years, Frank felt his armor crack. He did not collapse, did not give in fully, but he allowed himself to feel the weight of everything he had locked away. The hardened veteran, so used to silence, found himself standing at the edge of something he had sworn he would never risk again. Trust, forgiveness, the possibility of connection. His walls had been built strong, but tonight, against the return of the son and the loyalty of the dog who refused to forget, they began to crumble. Max seemed to sense the weight in the air more keenly than either of the men. Where silence had stretched into something brittle, his movements broke it with a warmth that neither Frank nor Daniel could ignore. The dog pressed his chest against the gate, nose pushing to the bars, tail sweeping the ground in broad, hopeful arcs. He let out a low whine, not of fear or warning, but of insistence, as though he were reminding them that what stood between them was not the years of anger or silence, but simply the gate, a piece of iron that could be opened. Frank shifted his grip on his cane, his shoulders taut with the strain of holding himself upright in the face of so many colliding emotions. He could not remember the last time his heart had felt this unsettled. Across from him, Daniel stood with hands at his sides, his posture still cautious, as if bracing for rejection. But Max, unwilling to leave the distance unchallenged, pulled back a step and then pressed forward again, this time nudging the bars of the gate hard enough that it rattled on its hinges. His paws scraped at the dirt, impatient, urging. It was a simple action, but in it was something undeniable. Loyalty shared, a bond that had never been broken. For years, Max had been Frank's shield, his only companion, the one who absorbed his loneliness and returned it with unflinching devotion. But now, at the sight of Daniel, the dog's behavior revealed another truth. He had not forgotten the man who once crouched beside him as a pup, who whispered encouragement during those awkward early training days, who laughed when Max tripped over his own oversized paws. That memory still lived in him, and it bridged what the years had torn apart. Frank's jaw tightened, but his eyes flicked toward Daniel, and then back to Max. The dog turned his head from one to the other, tail still sweeping, as if unwilling to accept the tension between the men he loved. He pressed against Frank's leg, nudging his knee, then turned back to the gate and pawed at the space near Daniel's boots. Each gesture was clear. He wanted them closer, wanted the circle complete again. Daniel lowered himself slightly, crouching so he was closer to the dog's eye level. His hand hovered in the space between, not quite daring to cross the gate fully. "He hasn't forgotten me," Daniel murmured, his voice carrying both wonder and a quiet plea. "Not after all this time." His eyes lifted toward Frank, waiting for the acknowledgement he longed for. Frank's throat felt thick, the words caught somewhere between pride and pain. He had leaned on Max for so long, seeing him as a wall against the world. Yet here was that same dog refusing to be only a guard. Instead, Max demanded to be a bridge, forcing his master to see what he wanted to avoid. Loyalty had not chosen sides. It encompassed them both, binding the old man and the estranged son with a thread stronger than bitterness. Max's persistence grew. He let out a sharp bark, startling in its suddenness, then immediately followed with another low whine, pressing his nose insistently against Frank's hand. The message was unmistakable. Act. Do something. Break the stillness that had grown unbearable. For the first time, Frank's hand loosened on the cane and rested, almost uncertainly, on Max's head. His fingers threaded through the coarse fur, grounding him, steadying the storm inside. The dog leaned into the touch and then angled his body so that his flank pressed toward the gate, pushing both men closer, reducing the gap in the most physical way he could. Daniel's breath came unevenly as he watched the exchange. He had expected rejection, perhaps even rage, but this silent encouragement from the animal that knew them both, felt like an invitation he had not dared to hope for. Slowly, cautiously, he slid his hand nearer the bars, palm open, leaving it where Max could reach him, but also where Frank could see that the offer was made. Max sniffed the space eagerly, tongue flicking out to graze Daniel's fingers, tail whipping with joy. Then he turned back toward Frank, pressing insistently against him once more, urging him to look, to recognize, to let the years fall away for a moment. Frank's eyes met his son's, and for the first time since Daniel had returned, the gaze did not hold only anger. It carried exhaustion, yes, but also a quiet acknowledgement of something deeper. The years could not be erased, nor the pain undone. But standing here with Max nudging them both, pressing for unity, Frank could not deny that perhaps some bridges still stood, waiting to be crossed. The night was still damp from the storm, the smell of wet earth heavy in the air, but in that moment, the air seemed to shift, not with resolution, not yet with forgiveness, but with the first fragile step towards something less fractured. Max barked again, softer this time, almost triumphant, as though declaring that it had done his part. He had drawn them nearer, tail wagging, body insistent, the bridge between a father and a son who had nearly let silence become permanent. Neither man spoke. They didn't need to. For the first time in years, it was enough to simply stand there, connected by the dog who refused to let the bond between them remain broken. The gate had always been more than iron and hinges. It had been a line in the dirt, a symbol of separation, of guarded lives and words unsaid. For years, Frank had stood behind it with Max at his side, watching the world with suspicion, determined to let nothing enter that could unsettle the fragile order he had built. Now, with Daniel standing before him, the years of silence and distance pressed in like a weight that could no longer be ignored. Yet Max refused to let the gate remain the last barrier. His tail wagged with force that shook his whole body, his nose darting between Frank and Daniel, as though he would drag them together himself if they refused to move. Frank's fingers tightened around the latch, the old metal rough beneath his callous skin. His body resisted, stiff with habit and pride, but something deeper, the look in Max's eyes, the tremor of longing in his son's face, pushed against his stubbornness. He exhaled slowly, the sound loud in the heavy air, and at last lifted the latch. The gate creaked open, not wide at first, just enough to signal a decision. Max seized the opening with a burst of joy, bounding forward, his paws kicking up dirt, rushing to stand between them both as though ensuring neither would turn away. Daniel stood motionless, his hands loose at his sides, shoulders tensed as though one wrong move might send everything crumbling back into silence. He searched his father's face, waiting for anger, for a reprimand, for the wall that had been built over years of absence to close again. Instead, he found Frank's gaze raw and unsteady, the edges softened not by words but by the presence of the animal who had remembered them both when they could not remember how to look at one another without bitterness. For a long moment, nothing moved but Max's tail, sweeping side to side like a metronome beating against the silence. Then, almost imperceptibly, Frank took a step forward. His boots scuffed against the ground. Each movement weighted with the reluctance of a man unaccustomed to yielding. Daniel's breath caught, his eyes burning, and before he could stop himself, he stepped forward too, closing the distance that had once seemed impossible. They met awkwardly at first, standing too close with too many years pressing between them. Frank lifted his hand as if to push his son back, but his palm faltered in midair and instead rested on Daniel's shoulder. The contact was clumsy, uncertain, but it carried more weight than any speech. Daniel's hand rose, hesitated, then closed around his father's arm with a grip that trembled, not from weakness, but from the force of restraint held too long. Max barked once, sharp and triumphant, then circled them both, pressing against their legs, tail beating at their sides. The push of his body forced them closer still, until the hesitation cracked and something older, deeper, reclaimed its place. Frank let out a sound that was half a sigh, half a growl of surrender, and pulled Daniel into a full embrace. The years of anger, of pride, of silence collapsed under the weight of something simpler, the recognition that blood and memory still bound them, no matter how hard they had tried to deny it. Daniel buried his face against his father's shoulder, his arms tightening with the desperation of a son who had imagined this moment 100 times yet never believed it would come. He smelled the faint trace of smoke that always clung to Frank's clothes, the earthiness of sweat, the sharp tang of leather from the cane strap still looped around his wrist. These scents, once distant memories, returned with startling clarity, pulling him back to childhood mornings in the yard, to training sessions with Max when the world had felt whole. Frank's chest rose and fell unevenly. He did not weep. He had not allowed himself that release in years, but the tightness around his eyes betrayed the strain. His hands gripped Daniel's back with the strength of a man who did not know how to show softness, except through the firmness of his hold. It was not an embrace of ease, but of necessity, an admission that though they had been divided, the bond had not died. Max pressed his head between them, his ears flicking, whining softly as if to remind them he had waited for this moment. His loyalty had been unshaken, his memory unclouded. While the men had lost their way in anger and distance, he had carried a thread that connected them, never letting it fray entirely. Now, with their arms around each other, he seemed to settle, panting happily, content that his duty had been fulfilled. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of wet soil left by the storm. Above them the sky had cleared, stars faintly scattered, the storm clouds retreating to the horizon. Around the house, the neighborhood was quiet, unaware of the change taking place at the old gate. What had once been the site of fear and suspicion now held something fragile but real, a reconciliation born not of words but presence, of a dog's unyielding faith that neither man could ignore. Frank did not speak, and Daniel did not push for words. They remained in that embrace, their breaths uneven but steadying, both aware that something long closed off had been opened again. Max leaned against them with the satisfaction of one who had never doubted, the bridge that had carried them back across years of silence. For the first time and longer than either could remember, father and son stood not as strangers divided by anger, but as family pulled together by the loyalty of a dog who never forgot. Word traveled faster than anyone expected. In the quiet suburb where routine had ruled for so long, any break in the rhythm became gossip worth repeating. And what had been seen at Frank's gate spread from one porch to another like sparks across dry grass. For years, Max had been the dark shadow behind the fence, the reason children pedaled wide into the street and adults crossed the other sidewalk. He was the embodiment of fear, his bark the alarm that sent shivers up spines and pulled curtains closed. Yet now, stories whispered over hedges and through kitchen windows painted a different picture. The same dog, once feared as untouchable, wagging his tail and pressing eagerly against the bars for someone other than Frank. The first in notice had been Mrs. Caldwell from across the street. She had spent countless afternoons complaining about Max's growling, certain he would one day escape and wreak havoc. But that evening she froze at her front window, coffee cup trembling in her hand, as she saw the animal not snarling, but leaping joyfully, tail beating the air like a flag. She called her neighbor within minutes, disbelief sharpening her voice. By nightfall, the story had already drifted down the block, each retelling colored with astonishment. The next day, the rhythm of the street shifted. More faces than usual lingered outside, pretending to sweep steps or water flowers, yet their eyes kept darting toward Frank's yard. The fence, once a barrier that no one dared near, became a point of curiosity. Max was there as always, but different. When the stranger, now seen coming and going with quiet familiarity, approached, Max bounded forward with joy that startled those watching. The dog's bark carried no threat, only a rush of excitement, as though every ounce of loyalty once reserved solely for Frank had opened to another. Whispers gathered at doorsteps. "Did you see that?" He wagged his tail. "I thought that beast'd know how." Maybe Frank's been lying about the dog's nature all along. Yet the tone was not entirely suspicious. There was a shift, a reluctant softening. For years, fear had shaped the neighborhood's perception, but the image of Max pressing against the gate with a look of unmistakable joy began to gnaw at that narrative. If the dog could love another, perhaps he was not the monster they believed him to be. Children, once kept at strict distance, edged closer under their parents' wary eyes. They did not dare approach fully, but the sight of Max wagging his tail cracked the hardened shell of their fear. For the first time, some of them lingered near the corner, watching in silence instead of sprinting past. One boy whispered to his sister that maybe Max wasn't all bad, though the adults were not ready to believe so quickly. Old suspicions do not vanish overnight. Frank noticed a change but said little. He had never cared for the opinions of his neighbors, yet he could not ignore the way eyes lingered longer at his fence, no longer only with resentment but with something more complicated. Pride mixed with unease in his chest. The loyalty of his dog had been his alone for so many years. Now that bond was shared, and while it unsettled him, also revealed a truth he had never wanted to confront, that isolation had not been entirely Max's doing. Daniel felt the weight of those eyes as well. He saw how the street seemed to hold its breath each time he appeared, how conversation stilled until he passed. He did not flinch from it, nor did he seek to explain. Instead, he let Max's behavior speak for itself. The dog, once a wall of teeth and growls, now greeted him with unrestrained joy, and anyone who cared to look could see that this was no trick of obedience. It was recognition, memory, and affection resurfacing after years buried. By the week's end, the neighborhood no longer spoke of Max in tones of only fear. Instead, he had become a puzzle, a story retold with uncertainty. Was he dangerous or simply misunderstood? Had Frank kept him that way, or had they all seen only what they wanted to see? For the first time in years, the narrative began to shift, and it was not because of words, but because of the wag of a tail that refused to be ignored. Behind the fence, Max remained himself, alert, loyal, watchful. But now, when he wagged his tail for Daniel, the sound of his claws against the dirt, the brightness in his eyes, carried beyond the gate. The neighbors could not look away. They had witnessed a crack in the image they had long believed unshakable, and in that crack, something entirely new was beginning to take root. The idea that perhaps even the fiercest loyalty could open itself again, even in the presence of long silence and fear. And as Max pressed once more against the bars, tail sweeping in wide arcs, it was not only Frank and Daniel who felt the change. It was a whole street, drawn unwillingly into the fragile rebirth of trust. The evening settled slowly over the street, the last light stretching long shadows across the cracked pavement and the weathered fence that had once divided more than just property. For years, that fence had been a symbol of separation. Frank and his dog on one side, the rest of the neighborhood on the other, suspicion and silence keeping the distance intact. But now, something different lingered in the air. The gate was closed as always, Max lying on the earth just beyond it, but the tension that had once seemed to radiate from him had melted away. His body stretched comfortably, head resting on his paws, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm that mirrored the calm of the two men sitting not far from him. Frank sat heavily in his old chair on the porch, the same chair that had borne the weight of his solitude for years. Daniel leaned against the railing, arms folded, his eyes shifting now and then toward his father, though he rarely spoke. They did not need to fill the silence with words, not tonight. Between them lay Max. Sprawled in a position he rarely showed outside the deepest trust. His body was loose, tail occasionally thumping against the boards as though reminding them he was still awake, still aware, still happy to have them near. The dog had always been the sentinel, the wall of teeth and fur that warned away intruders, the one constant Frank could rely on through the years of estrangement and bitterness. But here, in this twilight moment, Max looked nothing like the fierce guardian the neighbors had come to fear. His eyes, usually sharp and scanning, blinked with slow contentment. When Daniel reached down, Max rolled slightly, exposing his side in quiet invitation. It was a gesture of pure surrender, an acknowledgement of trust that could not be faked. Frank watched the heaviness in his chest, the sight cutting to the years of anger that had built walls far thicker than the fence that lined his yard. What neither man said, though both felt, was that Max had done what neither of them could. He had bridged the gap, not through argument or apology, but through the simple act of remembering. His loyalty had not been limited to one person. It had carried the imprint of both, woven into the very fabric of his being since the days when Daniel was a boy and Frank a younger father. In his growls, his hesitation, his sudden joy, the truth had been laid bare. The dog had never forgotten. And if Max could remember love after so much time, perhaps so could they. The neighborhood's watchful eyes had faded for the night, leaving the three of them in rare privacy. Frank shifted, joint stiff, and let out a long breath. Daniel glanced at him, but said nothing. Words seemed too heavy, too easily broken. Instead, Max lifted his head, nudged his nose against Frank's boot, then stretched the brush against Daniel's leg. The gesture was so ordinary, so natural, yet it carried the weight of everything that had passed. Neither man could deny the meaning. Max belonged to both of them, and in claiming that place, he had forced them to acknowledge one another. For Frank, who had built his life on control, it was disarming. For Daniel, who had built his on distance, it was grounding. The dog had pulled him into the same orbit, leaving no room for retreat. Frank's hand finally moved, rough fingers brushing over Max's fur. A moment later, Daniel's hand joined, and for the first time in years, both touched what had remained loyal in their absence. It was not an embrace between father and son, not yet, but it was something solid, something undeniable. The night grew darker, the hum of crickets rising in the grass, the air cooling around them. Max settled back into his place, the guardian now at rest, not because the world no longer held dangers, but because for once he no longer needed to stand alone. His eyes closed, but the faint twitch of his ears and the occasional sweep of his tail showed that his awareness never fully left. Yet his body spoke of peace, of bonds remembered and restored. Frank and Daniel remained as they were, close but quiet, with Max stretched between them as though he had claimed his role, not just as protector of a house, but as protector of a family. He was no longer only the feared dog of the gate. nor only the loyal companion to a single man. He was something greater, a reminder of what endures when everything else fractures. Anger had burned, distance had widened, time had eroded. But through it all, Max had carried a memory that had pulled them back together. In that quiet, the years did not vanish, but they softened. The silence was not the heavy silence of estrangement anymore, but the kind that comes when words are unnecessary. And as the stars began to the sky above, Max shifted once more, pressing himself closer to both men, his body bridging the space that had seemed impossible to cross. The beautiful reaction was not only his joy at reunion, but the peace he left in his wake. He had outlasted the anger, survived the distance, and endured the years. And now, in the fading light, he lay as proof that bonds, whether loyalty of love or blood, could bend but not break. Carrying all three of them into the night was something like hope.